Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Good afternoon and welcome to the Mid-Atlantic Regional Community of Practice Professional Training event, where we will focus on military culture and moral injury in veterans. This training is presented by Serving Together, a program of Every Mind, as part of the Regional Community of Practice efforts for the AmericaServes Mid-Atlantic region. This project was supported under a grant awarded by the Walmart Foundation to Syracuse University. As many of you may be familiar, Every Mind is a nonprofit organization out of Montgomery County, Maryland, whose mission is to strengthen communities and empower individuals to reach optimal mental wellness. We provide a variety of direct services for the entire lifespan, including a 24/7 hotline, homeless outreach, school-based mental health services, and much more. We also strive to reduce the stigma surrounding mental illness and increase the importance of mental wellness for everyone. For more information about Every Mind, you can visit everymind.org. In one of our many programs, Serving Together is focused on providing resources and assistance for our military veterans and their families in the National Capital Region. And among our objectives, we strive to provide education to the community to help better support our service members, veterans, and their families and caregivers. When it comes to Serving Together in Every Mind, we were selected to be the Regional Community of Practice Champion to support the work in the Mid-Atlantic region, which includes 3 AmericaServes coordination centers, with the goal to provide educational training opportunities to our network users, from Serving Together in the National Capital Region to our sister location in Mission United in South Hampton Roads, and our northern contacts up in AmericaServes in Greater Pittsburgh. So we conduct these trainings based on your feedback that we received, and we have more events lined up. And it's very crucial that we receive your feedback in order to make sure that we provide topics that you need. So we will provide a link at the end of this webinar that will ask for your feedback, and we encourage everyone to provide feedback so we know how the event went today, but also what information you would like to receive in future trainings. And as a reminder, this event does provide CEUs for those that attend the entire training. So we will have a slide at the end of this email with instructions on how to receive your certificate. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. We're going to have 2 presenters doing 2 different topics today. We'll have Jonathan Patrick, who will be providing an overview of military cultural competency and transition awareness. And then we'll have Dr. Paula Dominici, who will go over moral injury in veterans. To get started with Jonathan, I'd like to kind of give a brief introduction of him. Jonathan Patrick is a native of Roanoke, Virginia. He served in the United States Marine Corps from June of 2009 to September of 2017. Throughout his time in the Marine Corps, Jonathan served as an infantry rifleman and was assigned to numerous duties that included team leader, squad leader, platoon guide, platoon sergeant, company operations, and training chief, and the Marine Barracks, Washington, D.C. Military District, Washington liaison. Jonathan's last deployment was in 2012, where he completed a 7-month combat tour in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. After returning home from a deployment, Jonathan was hand-selected to represent the Marine Corps at Marine Barracks, Washington, D.C., which included duties at Arlington National Cemetery, the Pentagon, and the White House. Jonathan's personal military decorations include Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, and Combat Action Ribbon. After separating from the Marine Corps in September of 2017, Jonathan immediately began his career with the Virginia Department of Veteran Services, and on October 25th of 2018, Jonathan assumed his current position as the Veteran Justice Specialist, covering the department's northern region. As VGS, Jonathan provides outreach and support services to justice-involved veterans in courts, jails, and correctional facilities in the service area. Those services include, but are not limited to, needs assessment, service planning, care coordination, monitoring, and support. In his free time, Jonathan enjoys spending time with his family and friends, playing and watching basketball, and visiting historic sites throughout the United States. So I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan to provide some additional information about military, cultural, and transition awareness.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to be here. It is an honor to be able to represent the Virginia Department of Veteran Services and talk about military cultural competency and transition awareness. If you folks have any questions along the way, please let us know, and I will do my best to answer them when that time comes. All right, so I just wanted to put some pictures up there real quick, kind of put a face to the voice and name. So no, this is not a computer with a Southern accent talking to you. I am a real person, and happy to be here with you guys today and talk about the military. So military cultural competency. Some of you guys may ask, why is this important? And I'm sure that a good amount of you might have served in the military, or have family and friends that are veterans, or most likely even worked with a service member or veteran in your current position, whether you knew it or not. And we like to give this training, and it's intended to assist us as civilian and community service providers with a better understanding of communicating and effectively interacting with those service members and their families. And to me, and I know you guys are in the taking care of people business yourself, and to me, I look at this job as a community provider to serve them the best we can, and that's why we're here today. So our learning objectives, I'm going to read these out aloud, so just bear with me for a second here. So the first one, describe the military organizational structure, rank, branch of service, core values, and demographics. Second, identify differences between the active and reserve components and National Guard. Third, identify characteristics of military transitions from active duty, deployment, and reintegration to civilian life and the challenges that arise. Fourth, identify best practices to enhance behavioral health, treatment options, and resources for military service member veteran families, also known as SMVF, in community settings. Fifth, identify resources for SMVF caregivers and providers. And lastly, discuss the prevalence and characteristics of suicide among military service members and veterans according to federal state data sources. So that last one being said, due to the presentation that you guys are going to receive after this, I'm not going to get into that lane too much. And so you all know, I'm not a mental health professional in any way. I'm not a social worker counselor. The stories that I will tell and the examples I will give are solely based on my experience that I had in the military, and I'll do my very best to paint that picture of what it's like to be in the military, go on a deployment, and then coming out, and then we'll save the post-traumatic stress, military sexual trauma, and things like that for a little bit later on. Okay. So this is more current numbers of our military active duty population. Just take a quick second to glance over that. And if you get to the bottom and you're wondering what those three-letter words are, the first one there, OIF, that stands for Operation Iraqi Freedom. So that's operations in and support of things going on in Iraq. The next one would be Operation Enduring Freedom, OEF. That is operations in and support of Afghanistan. So me, having been to Afghanistan, I would be considered an OEF vet. And when you're talking to veterans, that might help they describe themselves. They're not going to say I was a Iraq veteran or an Afghanistan veteran. They may say I was OIF veteran, OEF veteran. So just things to keep in mind, that it means the same thing, but they might label themselves as one of those instead of saying the country that they went to, then veteran after that. And then one of the newer ones, OND there, that's Operation New Dawn. So from what I understand of that, in September about 2010, they had changed the name of Operation Iraqi Freedom to Operation New Dawn to kind of support the troop withdrawal and the mission that was changing over there. And there's constantly new operations going on, and there's going to be many more, and it's a lot to keep track of, but those are three of the most common ones that you're probably going to hear with veterans working at this time. And another one that I can think of that's not on there would be OIR, and that's Operation Inherent Resolve, and that's been the current fight against the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. You guys have probably heard them called ISIS, and they've been in the news recently, actually. So that's another one for you. And again, there's a lot of them, and it's hard to keep track of a bunch. All right, so demographics in the military. So I'd like to point out from the first two bullets, from a global perspective, the U.S. military present around the world often dictates how the world perceives our country. And a question that I think we often don't think about is how accurately the U.S. military population represents U.S. society as a whole. And to me, the answer to that is not very much. Historically, the military population, a half of what it was during the Vietnam War, when the transition from the draft for military service, and then we transitioned to an all volunteer force, which is in place today. And that means exactly what you think of being a volunteer is what it means. So from 1973 to present day, the folks that have decided to serve in the military, they have made the commitment and no one made them do it. They have volunteered to serve their country in whatever way or fashion that is. So, and some countries still have mandatory service. For us, we choose to be volunteers, but to throw a little fun fact in there, a good amount of countries do have mandatory service. And the one that kind of sticks out to me is Israel, which I believe, last time I checked, I believe they require all able-bodied citizens for service at least 18 months or longer, and that's for both males and females. So some countries have mandatory service, but for us, and since 1973, we continue to be an all-volunteer force. And the last bulletin, if you take a look at that, being under 1.2 million means that currently our military population is less than 1% of the U.S. population. If you live and work somewhere like I do in Northern Virginia, it's kind of hard to believe because we're around the Pentagon, Fort Belvoir, Quantico. It seems like there's a lot of military out there in certain areas throughout the country. And you kind of forget that it's not like that, like it is in Northern Virginia and other places of the country. But when you look at it as a whole and more of a bigger picture, that yeah, there might seem like there's a lot of military stuff going on and there's a lot of veterans everywhere, but considered to the U.S. population is 1% or less of that of the military. So, okay. So there's 6 facts up there. I like to pull from at least 3 of these. And my first one I'd like to talk about, you'll see that second bullet there, active duty force remains largely male dominated. So that being said, it's been like that through history, but women have made great strides and it's becoming more common and they do an outstanding job. And just to throw some numbers at you for the women and being represented in the military, the Air Force, from the last time we checked, has the highest percentage of female service members and service women, and that's at 19%. The Marines would be the least amount of women that serve, and they're about 8%. Okay, and then the Navy is at 18%, and the Army is at 14%. So again, still a lot of males, but women, MOSs and jobs. We'll talk about MOS later on, but jobs have been opening up to women, and it's becoming more common, and they've done an outstanding job. Okay. The second one I like to pull from here, you'll see, let's see, the 5th bulletin there. Military officers have considerably higher levels of educational attainment on average than enlisted personnel and U.S. adults. Okay, so the main reason for that is to become a military officer, you have to have at least a bachelor's degree. Okay. That being said, there are some enlisted personnel who decide for whatever reason that they may not want to be an officer, have a college degree, and they decide to go enlisted anyway. Okay. I've had a couple buddies who had college degrees and they were just more attracted to doing what an enlisted member did over being an officer. Okay. But a lot of enlisted personnel, most of them come out of high school or don't have a college degree, but they can go in the military as enlisted personnel, earn their degree while they're in. And if later on down the road they want to transfer and do like an officer candidate school or some kind of officer program, they have the ability to transfer over if they decide to later on down the road. And let's see, the last one I'd like to pull is at the very bottom there. There's much more to the U.S. military than the active duty force. I think a lot of people think of the military, they think of folks signing up for 4 years or however long it is. They leave home and they go to all these places and do all these things and then they come back. But there's a lot more to it than that. And you have active duty, you have reserve, you have guard, and we'll talk both about reserves and National Guard a little bit later on. Okay. Next, we like to throw this up here. A couple words that stick out to me in this quote is equality and diversity. For me, on equality, I think of the military as being a leader, if not the leader in the actual practice of equality. I have yet to discover through my time so far an organization that is as diverse as the military is. And that's not just in terms of race or ethnicity, but also with a huge variance in religion, native locations, cultural backgrounds. And throughout my time in the service, I remember us having Marines from Los Angeles, California, New York City, Montana, Alabama, you name a religion and a background, and we had it in our platoon. And if you do find another organization that is as diverse as the military, I'm willing to bet and guarantee it won't practice true equality like the military does, nor function as efficiently. Despite having groups with such wide spectrums and cultural and ethnic differences, we all have a new identity. I had a battalion commander always harp on there's two things usually on a camouflage uniform. You have the organization that you belong to, so United States Marines, United States Army, and on the other side, you have your last name, okay? When you have that uniform on, that's what you represent, and that's important to us, and that's something we take very seriously. And it's not just representing the organization that we belong to or our family name. Our lives depend on those to the left and the right of us, and it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter what color you are, what religion, none of that matters. The one thing that we have in common is that you're a soldier, you're a Marine, you're an airman, and you're a sailor, and that's something we take a lot of pride in, and we care about each other very much. And this is something I continue to experience to this day. Even with the older population, I have Marines and service members that might have served in Vietnam, and these folks might be 40 plus years older than me. But even with that age difference, it does not matter. All that matters is that he or she is a service member or a Marine, and I am too, and we're able to connect right away, and it's really an awesome thing to have. Okay, so we're going to go into the reserves now. So we talked about active duty, and we'll talk more about that later, but now we're going to get into the reserves and the guard. So the reserves, I want you guys to think of the reserves as these are folks that are just like us in the community. They live with us, they work with us, they go to school, their kids go to school with our kids, but at the same time, they do what we do as civilians. They also have chosen to serve their country at the same time. So if they're not on active duty orders, have been called to deployment, these folks will be found one weekend per month that they will join their units, and they will get training and do things like that. And then also 2 weeks out of the year, they'll go off and do training, and that'll be kind of more complex training and a little bit more into detail, stuff like that. So again, these are people that are in our community just like us, but they continue to serve their country at the same time. Okay. So some key takeaways from reserves. Big things that I want you guys to try to remember is the objective of the reserves is to deliver supplementary support to active duty forces when obligated, okay? And when it comes to veteran benefits, it kind of gets tricky when it comes to reserves and guardsmen. I still get tripped up on it every once in a while, but unless these people, reservists, are called to active duty deployments such as Iraq or Afghanistan, those weekend drills that they go to do not count towards their veteran benefits, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Reservists, they go through the same basic training, same schools as active duty, and then the President and Secretary of Defense can order those in the reserves to active duty at any time for combat operations. And if you look at the slide there, you'll see the Army, the Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, they all have their own reserve element. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, those are the folks that fall under the Department of Defense, and the Coast Guard usually falls under the Department of Homeland Security unless called upon, and we'll talk about the Coast Guard a little bit more because that can be confusing to some people, okay? All right, next, for this, individual ready reserve, I'll give my personal example for this. When I first joined the military, my contract was for 4 years active, 4 years in the reserve. So if I would have got out of the military after my first 4 years, I would have been able to go home, you know, start my new life as a civilian, go to school, but know that I may be subject to recall because I also had that obligation for that reserve time. The fact that I re-enlisted in the military and did 8.5 years. When I was done with that time, that took care of all my obligated service, and being on the ready reserves is something I did not have to worry about. So It's just something that usually contracts are different depending on what service you're in, but most service members enter this when they complete their obligated active duty time or reserve time that they may have to spend some time on the recall roster. But once that obligated service is done, this is something that they wouldn't have to worry about anymore. Okay, these just real quick, these are some of the Army and Air National Guard units in Virginia. Okay, some of you folks might be a part of this. And each state has units spread out through the state. So this is common in every state that you have. You'll have multiple units in each state. All right. So now we'll talk about the National Guard, and I'll break some of this down for you. Some key takeaways from this slide. The foremost difference between the National Guard and the reserves is that the federal government is in charge of the reserves, okay? While the National Guard units predominantly belong to individual states. There are two National Guard types, like we talked about before the slide. You have the Army National Guard and you have the Air National Guard. National Guard members attend basic training, like we talked about, and their military job school full-time under what's called ADT, and that stands for Active Duty for Training, and that's similar to the reserves, okay? Just like the reserves as well, they resume daily civilian life. They train 1 weekend per month. They have that 15 full-time training days like the reserves do. And again, this type of training time does not count towards veteran benefits. And also, like the reserves, the President and Secretary of Defense can call upon the National Guard in provision of military operations, okay? And that's that Title 10 that's located on your screen there. And this is the type of duty that does count for service requirements for veteran benefits. So whatever happens between that time for the reservists and guardsmen, whatever happens during that time of active duty, that is something that meets the requirements for veteran benefits later on down the road. And lastly, when it comes to the National Guard, state governors, okay, can call National Guard members to active duty if a state emergency arises. So this is where you see, say if there's a hurricane or a flood or some kind of natural disaster. Such emergencies include relief and protection of property and people outside the authority of local law enforcement. And even though they're called to do things like that, this form of state duty also doesn't count towards veteran benefits. And it's not just Virginia National Guard taking care of Virginians. I think of Louisiana when Hurricane Katrina helped. We sent people down there for that. The catastrophic storms down in the Virgin Islands and things like that, that members of different states can be called to go down there and be a joint effort with other National Guard units to take care of things like that within the community. All right, military language. Anybody that's been around a veteran may have heard them talking to each other, and you're probably thinking, what in the heck are they talking about? Okay, so some of the terms are used by all branches. So there's military language that's across the board, no matter what service you are, no matter what you do in the military. It's common that somebody can talk about that in the Air Force, and me being a Marine, I know exactly what they're talking about. But also, that being said, within each branch, there are subculture languages in different fields of work. So for example, I was an infantryman in the Marine Corps, so the lingo that the Intel Marines use might throw me off a little bit. I understand it for the most part, but even we're in the military, we're both in the military, but they do a different job than me, so they might use some different stuff. But what's interesting to me is, unlike other languages, the concept of you either use it or lose it doesn't apply. One really awesome thing to me about military language is if I'm meeting with a veteran for the very first time, we can speak to each other in this language, in this lingo, and I know exactly what they're coming from, and there's immediate connection with each other, which is nice. And if there's so much on this, guys, and I could take up probably another 30 minutes to an hour just talking about military language alone. But if you're more interested, and I'll give you some examples on the next slide, but there's all kinds of stuff out there. And if you guys ever run anything and have questions, feel free to email me at any time, and I'll be happy to answer them. So examples here, let me throw some up on the board here. All right, so the first one I like to break down, and you'll hear this a lot. You'll see MOS, okay? So MOS is Military Occupational Specialty, okay? So this is the codes for the jobs that folks do in the military. So for me, when I joined the Marine Corps, I joined on a 03, okay? I think it was 03XX from what I remember. So that was meaning if I was able to pass recruit training and make it to the School of Infantry, I would be an infantryman in general, okay? So I joined the Marine Corps. I went to basic training. I was able to earn the title of Marine, and then I went to what's called the School of Infantry to get my infantry training. From there, I graduated and I become a 0311. So for me, that means infantry rifleman. Later on down the road, when I became a staff sergeant, my MOS changed to 0369. So that's what it's like for every service. Every job that you had, there's an MOS code that goes with that. So you might hear guys say, maybe they're not an infantryman or in the Marine Corps or whatever. You may be able to ask them, so what'd you do in the military? Instead of asking them what their job was, maybe you can ask them what their MOS was and they'll be able to tell you. Okay. Moving on from that, chow. Chow is simply food, okay? We always joked around that chow time was our favorite time. It's not breakfast, it's not lunch, it's not dinner, okay? It's chow. If you want to talk about breakfast, you may say morning chow, or lunch is afternoon chow, dinner's evening chow. So chow is simply just food that we have in the military. That's what we call it, okay? Squared away. You might hear squared away to explain somebody that looks sharp in their uniform. They got their stuff together. They're good at their job. You might hear somebody say, man, that Marine is squared away, or that person, that airman, that sailor, that soldier is squared away. They got their stuff together. They know exactly what they're doing, and they are a go-to person when you need something done, okay? In theater. So in theater is just another way to say, like, while I was in Afghanistan, when I was in Iraq, you might hear some veterans say when I was in theater. Okay, so that's what that means. And then cover. So what we think of as civilians as a baseball cap or a beanie or a stocking cap or whatever you want to call it in the military, if it's on your head and it's a uniform item, it's considered a cover. Okay, I used to have Marines that would slip up and be like, hold on, Sergeant, I got to grab my hat. And I would always joke around and correct them. It's like, no, you don't have to grab your hat. You have to grab your cover. Okay. So again, there's so much out there. There's plenty you could look up. There's acronyms. There's code names for stuff. And there's a lot to keep track of. Okay. So moving on to culture of the military. A big takeaway for me on this is for you guys is that there is mass structure and organization in the military. Some folks don't like it. For me, this is part of what I loved about the military the most. And the military takes care of your needs, and there's always a rule or regulation for doing anything. And again, some people don't like it. For me, it worked for me. I needed that at my point in my life, and I just really just soaked it up, and I loved everything about it. And another thing I loved about being in the military is that we didn't train to a timeline, we trained to a standard. However long it took to achieve and maintain that standard, it didn't matter. The big things for us was mission accomplishment and troop welfare. And that's something, again, that's what we work towards, and we want to be the best we could be about it. And sometimes when people join the military, they may come from broken homes and they didn't have this growing up. And then they join the military and they become tight with these folks and they get this structure in their life. And a lot of times that we've seen that sometimes when this structure is taken away from somebody, this is when it may resort for people to go back to old behaviors that were problematic before entering the military. Okay. Next, so core values, won't spend too much time on this. Just know you'll see some common themes in this slide. You have words like honor, service, commitment. Again, speaking as a Marine, because that's what I know best, this honor, courage, commitment is drilled into you from day one. And it's something that it's not just a core value. It's not just something that we say. It's something that we live by. Again, we take it very seriously. And if you're not on board with what your core values are, we're not going to tolerate it. Okay. So it's again, it's not just 3 words and a bunch of hoorah stuff to get you fired up. It's a code that we live by, and it's very near and dear to our heart. Okay, so I'm gonna go into the services right now. Just break each one down. I won't spend too much time on it, but you'll notice at the top, not only do I have Army, but I have soldier. So folks that are in the Army, considered soldiers, okay, and their mission, as you see, is to fight and win our nation's wars with sustained land dominance across full range of military operations, okay? Some other key takeaways is that the Army is the oldest and they are the largest branch. And being a Marine, I may argue that the whole thing main ground force, we might give each other a hard time for that, but The Army's been doing this a long time, and they're just as good. I may joke around a lot being a Marine, but you know, it's one team, one fight, and the Army, they do a great job. Okay, and during OIF and OEF, so Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom, what we found is their normal deployments are about 12 to 16 months long. So that's a long time. I've heard less than that. I've heard even more than that. But that's Army also sets herself apart from other branches when it comes to the deployment lengths that they do. We'll talk more about the other branches and how long they're deployed, okay? All right, in the Navy, if you're in the Navy, you're also considered a sailor, okay? The mission of the Navy is to maintain, train, and equip combat-ready naval forces capable of winning wars, deterring aggression, and maintaining freedom of the seas. The Navy is the second largest branch and, of course, the main naval force. I read something the other day where America supposedly, and it sounds, there's no way it's not true, but the Navy for America is the largest Navy in the world, okay? And I've heard this about the Air Force too. And if you were to take number 2 to number 8 navies that are behind America and put them together, they still wouldn't be as large as our American Navy, which gets me pumped up, and it's good to know that we have such a big Navy and such a big Air Force. Okay, and as a Marine, again, you'll see Department of the Navy. We'll talk about that when we get to the Marine Corps. Marine Corps is Department of the Navy. I don't even want to bring that up, but I felt like it was the right thing to do. So they always make sure that they remind us of that we are Department of the Navy. All right. So Air Force, you have Airman mission to fly, fight, win, and then in the air. I've heard some people think of the Air Force and they think of nothing but pilots. Okay, there are pilots in the Air Force, but there's a lot of other jobs as well. Okay, and a big thing that's up and coming, and you're going to probably see more of, especially with technology the way it is that you have space and cyberspace. All right, so not only are they taking care of the air defense and the other things that the Air Force offers, but they're talking about focusing on space and cyberspace. They are the youngest branch. They date back to 1947. There used to be a thing what was called the Army Air Corps that was a part of the Army, and then they broke off and became their own Air Force in 1947. Okay, you have the Marines. So Marines are trained, organized, equipped for offensive amphibious employment and as a force in readiness. Okay, so you'll see words like counterinsurgency. So counterinsurgency from the Department of State is they define it as a comprehensive civilian and military efforts taken to simultaneously defeat and contain insurgency and address it at the root cause. So it's a group effort to take care of something. And they get Fallujah up there as an option. Fallujah was a mass operation that took not just the Marines, but a lot of people in support of to get that done. And Fallujah is something, again, that we learn about. It's one of the major battles in our history. And it was some of the heaviest urban combat that Marines and soldiers and everybody else had faced since the Battle of Way City in Vietnam in 1968. And a big key takeaway from the Marines, and we consider ourselves the subject matter experts when it comes to combat, training, and small unit leadership. We work on mastering those, and we've been very good at it for a very long time. All right. Lastly, but certainly not least, you have the Coast Guard. Their mission, multi-mission force. So this is the organization that falls under the Department of Homeland Security. You'll see that at the bottom, but can be transferred to the United States Navy by the President in times of war. And they've done exactly that. I feel sometimes the Coast Guard doesn't get enough credit for all the cool things and the great things that they do, but they've deployed to Iraq, they've deployed to Afghanistan. So not only have they served their country abroad, but they continue to protect our coast back here at home. You'll hear them on the news sometimes with port security. You'll see it up there in the presentation. Patrols, drug interdiction, and law enforcement. So that's when you might hear drugs are trying to be smuggled into the coast near Miami or something, and the Coast Guard will go out and intercept those ships that wreck. They go out and rescue them. So they do a lot of cool stuff. And I went to a joint class one time that kind of talked about when I was in the military, they kind of learned more about the services, and I swear the Coast Guard was the most fascinating with me, and they do all kinds of good stuff. So give them some more credit. All right, this just breaks down the birthdays, total number there. Right, so rank structures. So some key takeaways from this, 2 main categories we got here. We have an enlisted and we have officers. You'll see pay grades right there, E1 through E9. So to explain that a little bit better, you have a pay grade and then you have a rank. So I'll give my example for this. So when I got out of the Marine Corps, my pay grade was E6, okay? but my rank was staff sergeant. So it's just not, there's no difference whatsoever. It's just my pay grade was E6 and my rank was staff sergeant at the time. You'll see the word officer and non-commissioned officers. They are not officers, but they are vital, and they are usually the backbone to those services. NCOs, you see E4, E5. Each service is different to what they consider a non-commissioned officer, but for in the Marine Corps, it's E4, E5, and then other services you have E6 to E9. Okay, warrant officers, highly trained specialists, and then you have your officers. These are our folks that requires a bachelor's degree, that they go to school first, and then they transfer over to the officer program. And it's unique in the military because you may have a command sergeant major in the Army, which is an E9, okay, that served 25 maybe plus years and holds the highest enlisted rank in the Army, but is required to salute a second lieutenant, okay, which is an O1 in the military, probably had less than a year. It's just the way the military works, but it works, and it's that way for a reason. And something to remember, that military rank is more than just who salutes whom, okay? Military rank is a badge of leadership, responsibility for personnel, equipment, and mission grows with each increased rank, just like any other place in the workplace. As you get promoted, it brings more responsibilities, more things that are required of you. And regardless of service branch, a service member can know where an enlisted officer falls in the hierarchy. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some strengths. So unfortunately, we often hear from the media or whoever it may be about all the problems that veterans face, how broken we are, blah, blah, blah. But what you don't hear is everything we bring from our service. And I can promise you, we learn these skills not only from a classroom, but from personal experience. And you may ask, and I've questioned this myself, can military leadership apply to what it takes to be successful in the civilian workforce? And the answer and the conclusion I've come to is absolutely yes, okay, no matter what you're doing, and especially in human services. While I was in the military, there was no boundary of personal versus professional. To me and for everybody else, it's all personal. As a leader, if I had a Marine that was struggling, it was my responsibility to help them fix it, okay? Whether it was financial issues, mental health, or just personality things that were going on. As that leader, I'm responsible for the morale, I'm responsible for the discipline, and I'm responsible for the efficiency of my Marines, okay? And their performance would reflect the image of me as a leader. It is my responsibility to take care of them, and I have to take care. I am the leader, I am the commander, and I have to take ownership of what's going on. And we're just now catching on that these issues outside of work affect performance, and it's not necessarily our job to fix it all, being in the human service role. However, we can enhance the morale by connecting them to what they need to improve on. Okay, so if you're not the person that's able to help them, you have organizations such as Virginia Department of Veteran Services. There's all kinds of stuff out there that if you're not able to help them, at least knowing who you can turn to get that help for that veteran. Okay. Next, we'll start to talk about stressors in military life. And before I get going on this, guys, this is not to complain or be like, oh, I had to do this and that while I was in the military. Feel sorry for me. For all of us, for the most part, we knew what we were getting ourselves into, and these normal stressors of military life is just what comes with it. So the first one you'll see, they talk about frequent moves, okay? So for the folks, whether it's 4 years, 8 years, or 20 years, you're most likely going to end up moving at one point or another. And it's not just the veteran, it's not just a service member that goes through this, okay? For me, being a single guy in the military, it was easy for me. I got orders somewhere else. I packed up my sea bag, I put it in the back of my truck, I drove to my next place of duty, and I checked in. It was easy, okay? I was responsible for myself, and that was it. But for the people that have families, they have kids, it's a lot more that goes into it. You're probably going to change locations every 2 to 3 years, and you got to think the people that spend 20 plus years in the military, they might move 10, 15, even more times than that, okay? And that takes a toll on the children. You'll see changing schools, loss of friends. Anybody can understand how that can be hard on a child. And for spouses too, okay? They find a job that they like, and then they got to change it, and then they got to find new doctors, and then they make really good friends, and all that gets taken away. But if you stay in the military long enough, you may have some kind of say of like, hey, I'd like to stay here or go there. But at the end of the day, the military is going to send you where they need you to go, and that's just part of the deal, okay? We talked about deployment times earlier. Army, think about being gone from your family for 12, 15 months, 7 months, 9 months. That could take a toll on anybody, okay? The spouse becomes a single parent. The children don't have their mom or their dad at home anymore. We don't know what's going to happen to them on the deployment. So it can bring a lot of stress. And that, along with that stress is also financial stress. When I was in, I decided to rent the entire time that I was in. But a lot of people do buy homes. So if you get orders to somewhere else, you may have to sell your home and then worry about where you're going next and finding a new place to stay. So that can add up. And I focus on a lot of the stressors here on this slide, but something that I want to speak to is the strength of military families. And with all these stressors, at the same time comes resiliency, there comes flexibility, okay? And you'll often see that military communities, military families are very tight-knit and they take care of one another. All right, so this just breaks down recent conflicts. These are the major operations that have taken place. There are still military operations being carried out today with multiple deployments, multiple theaters of operation. And if you see at the bottom there, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, but National Guard and reservists have been called upon more than ever since 2001 in the global war of terrorism, and they've done an outstanding job. Okay. Some key takeaways from this that kind of sets us apart from past conflicts. Go to bullet number 2 there, longer deployments. So units and individuals have multiple deployments. That's been more common than ever. Some have, I served with Marines, they had 5, 7 deployments, if not more than that. And that's a lot of time to be gone. So you're thinking I'm gone for 7 months or I'm gone for 12 to 15 months. And then I do that deployment, I come back home, I have some time with my family, and then depending on what's going on in the world, I'm going to spin right back up and do it all over again. Okay, so and that can add up to years away from being home. Another thing to take from this is high intensity guerrilla warfare. Combat has changed ever since, just like anything else has. And we started kind of seeing guerrilla warfare more in the Vietnam War, but this is an atypical type of warfare, okay? There's no clear identified enemy, which adds a stress all into its own. It's strict on our rules of engagement of what we can go after, our standard operating procedures. Not knowing who the enemy is makes just everything else so much harder because you really have to be careful before you make a decision and you react to something. And then you have, of course, you hear a lot the IEDs, improvised explosive device, and then the RPGs as rocket propelled grenades. That's more common in Iraq and Afghanistan. And with that and new advancements in body armor in the vehicles, this has had prevented deaths. However, more have survived, but with increased traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder, and many experience traumatic injuries from things such as RPGs and IEDs that will remain with them for the rest of their lives, okay? And of course, thankfully, there's been the technology, the medical technology has advanced, so it's been able to save a lot more people's lives than it used to in prior conflicts. Okay, so this is a emotional cycle of deployment. Every job is different and it might look a little bit different, but some of the emotion that you may feel on a pre-deployment, things like anxiety, anticipation, denial, it is mentally and physically demanding. So even pre-deployment, I'm getting ready to go on deployment. So even though that I'm home getting ready to deploy, I'm still away because I have to train, I have to go out, and that might be for 2 weeks, a month, if not longer than that. And then you finally deploy. Okay, and some emotions that you might feel are sadness, loneliness, being overwhelmed with all the responsibilities that you had. For me, my first time in Afghanistan, I was 20 years old. I had a fire team of Marines. I had 4 people that I was responsible for. I was landing helicopters in foreign countries. Where else can a 20-year-old do things like that? So at a young age, all this responsibility was put on me, and I was ready for it because they trained me well. But also, it can be overwhelming with all the responsibilities that you have. And then you move into the sustainment. You get later on in the deployment, this new routines are established. You get confident, you're independent. I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm squared away, as we talked about earlier. And then we start to move into the redeployment, coming home. So there's anticipation, there's apprehension, there's excitement, like, oh, I'm excited to go home, but I'm also scared at the same time because it's going to be so much different from what I've experienced these last couple of months. And then you get home. Okay, you got your post-deployment time. We call this the honeymoon period, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But this is the reintegration, negotiation of responsibilities with the spouse. And depending on what's going on, you might be home, get some time with your family, and then you're going to go right back to training. You're going to do it all over again. So you can see how, and again, we knew what we were getting ourselves into when we signed up, but you can see how this can become a vicious cycle once you do it over and over and over again and start to cause some problems with some families. Okay, so again, we'll talk about this more in the presentation that's coming after, but some things that we've seen: survivor's guilt. You see in quotations there, I would have done something differently. So this is guys and girls beating themselves up about, you know, man, if I could have go back and do it all over again, I'd change this. And then lastly, I always like to point out, and as you guys can imagine, anytime children are involved, it makes things so much harder, whether, you know, they are part of the collateral damage or they get in the middle of a firefight. That can really tear up some people when children are involved, especially for the folks that have families back home. So that could really start to mess with some people, and we've seen that a lot. Okay, so then the paradox. So here's this honeymoon period that we just talked about. And so the honeymoon period is when a service member is excited and elated to be home. Okay, he has the opportunity to reconnect with family and friends, and this could last a few hours. Okay, but after all the parades and the welcome home celebrations, or a few weeks as they settle back into their routine, you can see how they may have trouble adjusting, especially nowadays. I could be on the battlefield and back in my living room within 48 to 72 hours, if not faster than that. So it's crazy to think about. And while in theater, in a combat zone, my responses helped the service member. You know, it helped us remain alert, safe, and ready. But the challenge is, how do I modify these responses when I transition back to civilian life? Okay. I'll go through these quickly, guys. So for me, some may argue everyone is changed by war. For me, combat was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Okay. But at the same time, it was the worst experience of my life. I was able to witness the very best of what a human being is capable of doing. But at the same time, you also see the very worst of what somebody is capable of doing. And here I am on the battlefield doing things like this. Okay. So then my deployment's over, 48, 72 hours, if not faster than that. I go from being on the battlefield, now I'm back home with my family, and I'm surrounded by things like this. All right. If you live in Northern Virginia, you know all about this. All right. Large crowds. This stresses me out just looking at it. Looks like we got some rollback prices there at Walmart, so that's always nice. Okay. Not everybody. Some can be startled by fireworks, especially if they're not expecting it. Okay, and again, that's not every veteran. Everybody handles things differently. All right, and then I have a hard time coming back and relating things that I experienced to my spouse. So I have what's bothering me from my deployment, and then there's some stressors because I'm not be able to relate to my spouse, and that turns into different problems and different stressors. So that you can see how they can start to stack. Those stressors can start to stack on top of each other very quickly. Okay, so we just like to throw that up there because you'd be surprised. There's a lot of veterans that served active duty time, did 4 years, discharged honorably, but they may be like, they'll tell me like, Pat, I go by Pat. They'd be like, man, I didn't do anything. I didn't really deploy or whatever. And they may not think they're veterans. As you heard before in the bio, I work with veterans that are involved in the criminal justice system. And even though that they are considered veterans, they might not even admit that they are veterans because they may be embarrassed that now they're incarcerated. So we just like to throw that up there. And this definition just explains that any individual that completed a service for any branch of armed forces classifies as a veteran as long as they were not dishonorably discharged. Okay. However, if you remember back to the reserves and the Guard, with regards to the applicable benefits, other considerations are important to be considered. So remember how we talked about how the training for the Guard and reserves may not necessarily make them meet the requirements for veteran benefits later on down the road. Okay. And this is our veteran population. All right, you'll see at the bottom there 7.2 million Gulf War veterans, so that includes the first Gulf War and then current operations. And then right behind that is our Vietnam veterans with well over 6 million Vietnam veterans. And also our greatest generation, like folks that you see down there in the pictures, are unfortunately getting to the age where they're passing away, but there are still a good amount of them out there as well. Okay, so some more stressors here. A big one for me was finding a new identity. If you talk to anybody in the military, and this is not just the Marine Corps, but soldiers, sailors, anybody. For me, being in the military and being a Marine, it wasn't just a job. It wasn't just a career. It's who I was. Okay, it's who I am, and it's who I'll be to the day I die. So even though I'm not in the Marine Corps anymore, I still do my very best to conduct myself as one and hold those core values still near and dear to my heart and take that with me for the rest of my life. So for a lot of people, that can be a struggle to transition from that and find that new identity. And then forming that new support group. I'm back home in the middle of nowhere, Virginia, hanging around people that caused problems before. And while I was in the military, I had people to the left and the right of me that would give their life for me and not even think twice about it. And now I'm back home and I don't have that support group like I used to. And there's other stressors like choosing a permanent home, healthcare, employment. Those are things that the military took care of us. They took care of us with all of those things, okay? And for those young people that went to the military and didn't necessarily have to worry about healthcare and employment, and then the military takes care of all that for you, when they transition, you can see how this can kind of be stressful for a young man or a young woman to like, okay, the military's not taking care of me anymore and I got to figure this out on my own. And you can see how that could probably be stressful for some folks. And then again, not just the veteran, but the family members that go through this as well. And go back to employment as well is what I like to think about is, for me, when I got out of the military, I felt like I was in a good place to separate from the military. So I felt comfortable walking away, and I knew that the military wasn't it for me anymore, but at the same time, I didn't necessarily know what I wanted to do next. And I got lucky. I found the Virginia Department of Veteran Services, and it all worked out for me. But you can see how some people, and especially doing what I was doing, like, yeah, okay, so I located and I closed with and I destroyed the enemy. I kicked in doors. I was trained to be violent. And not only was I trained to do those things, but I was good at it. So who wants to hire me? Okay. So it's not as easy as what some military folks think it's going to be. I'm going to get out. I got all this good training. And to be completely honest with you, some people just, they don't care about that and they may not want to hire them. And it's not as easy as what some veterans think it's going to be when they're separating from the military. Okay, so transition again, we'll continue here. We usually see that maybe National Guard and Reserve have more challenges due to the loss of lack of support systems. So most of them come from rural areas and they're no longer connected to their unit and buddies. So they were at their civilian life and job and then they deployed and now they're right back into their civilian again. And some other things that we see, you'll see transition challenges, a few things labeled off there. So things like rebalancing the children's responsibilities between the parents, getting to know deployed spouses and parents again, and then worrying about the next deployment. So it's just one thing after another. And again, you can see how after time, this can start to affect families and cause more stress in the life there. Okay, so these are just some common transition and adjustment responses. I'm sure Dr. Paulo will talk more about this too. The big thing from this is that these responses to combat, these are normal, okay? These are normal reactions to have to being in a combat situation, but we found that when they persist about 1 to 3 months afterward is when they could probably start to cause problems in some functioning. Okay, again, I love that quote. I think it sums it up perfectly. And then again, these things left untreated, negative symptoms can persist for years or even a lifetime. Okay. So post-traumatic stress, different from combat stress, some things that we've seen, people become easily annoyed and frustrated. They're not sleeping. They feel numb. We've heard anything from nightmares. And again, these are normal, okay? These responses in combat are normal, but when they continue to go on is when they could maybe turn into post-traumatic stress or something like that. I'm sure Dr. Paula may talk about that a little bit more later on, okay? All right. these are just the numbers for you, breaking down. I won't bore you too much. One thing I want to take out of the Vietnam veterans is they seem like they've gotten a lot better about coming and receiving help, which is great to see. But at the same time, I've had Vietnam veterans in my office, and they'll literally have tears running down their face, and they still don't want to talk about it. But just the fact that they came in to see us, or maybe grab a cup of coffee or something, the fact that they're just coming in and starting that progress is great. But it does seem like Vietnam veterans are getting a lot better about coming in and getting some help. Okay, so traumatic brain injuries, again, this may be something that, you know, just from the pure blast, or from a rocket propelled grenade or landmines or explosive devices, may cause a traumatic brain injury, and there might not even be any physical wounds whatsoever. And a lot of mild TBIs is most prevalent. Some people might be living with these things and not even know that they have it. Okay, it talks a little bit more about that. All right, so closed brain injuries are the most common type that are caused by the change of pressure from improvised explosive devices, IEDs, okay? And another key takeaway from this is not all TBIs exhibit physical wounds. So you may have guys that were just being around the blast, but there might not be no blood, there might be nothing done to their bodies, but inside it caused some problems when it comes to the brain and being around blasts like that. Okay, again, so cognition, you know, poor concentration, slower processing. When it comes to emotion, anxiety, depression, irritability, and behavior, this is where we see aggression, anger, and could all be caused from post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. All right, we just like to throw that slide up there. All right, you'll see that they're very similar. Okay, one person might have post-traumatic stress disorder and not a TBI. Some of them might have both. It's just hard to tell because they're so similar. Okay, we're almost done here, guys, so hang in there. One of the last slides here, just some common coping mechanisms. So this is some stuff that we see. We all know that alcohol doesn't help anything, and that's something that I can speak about. Being a young man in the Marine Corps, you get really good at drinking alcohol, okay, and sometimes, unfortunately, that carries over to deal with some of the problems and issues and struggles that you may have. Weapon security, perimeter control. I talk about this when I talk to the police departments about the criminal justice aspect of it. In the military, we are trained in these weapon systems. We know security. We know our house better than anybody. So I always talk to the police officers, and they know it already, but just something to think about when you are going, if you have to go to a veteran's home or something like that, that they most likely may have weapons in there. So just something to keep in mind. Isolation, unfortunately, that's one of the things that we may turn to just to avoid anything that may remind me of that incident that bothers me and might completely isolate myself. This is where you might see substance abuse and breaking off from anybody that cares about us and getting away from that. And it doesn't help anything whatsoever. And then issues at home, again, I have stressors from my deployment, I have stressors from being in the military, then my wife and my family, we're not getting along, so it could just be one stress after another. And for me, working in the criminal justice system, this is something that I see a lot when we're talking about just stress in general, is that a lot of these people that are incarcerated in their veterans, they had trauma before they joined the military, and then they may have had trauma while they were in the military, and then if they might have had military sexual trauma, and then now they're incarcerated and they're trying, you know, that's a stressor as well. So it's just one thing, again, stacking on top of each other. Higher adrenaline risk behavior for the ones that have experienced combat, and not to scare you guys at all, but for me, combat, it's hard to explain the excitement and the rush that you feel once the smoke settles, the guns cut off, and you know that all your buddies are okay. Like, it is such a rush. And we see a lot that this might where you see where veterans drive their motorcycles when they get back home 100 miles an hour on the highway, because they're trying to match what they had, okay? Because a lot of people get you know, attached to that kind of stuff, and they want to feel that way again, and they're not able to come back home and find the rush that they had in combat back home doing regular day stuff. And then overspending, whether that's, you know, buying things that make you feel better and things like that. Because in the military, I know I'm getting paid on the 1st and the 15th, and I'm going to buy whatever I need to make me feel better. Okay. All right. Military sexual trauma. I hate to just skip through this stuff, but I know I'm getting tight on time. You know, unfortunately, military sexual trauma is still a thing. And it's not just in female veterans, but it happens for males as well. So I'm sure that you guys see this, unfortunately, but you have military sexual trauma, so they might have something like that going on in addition to the post-traumatic stress disorder or the TBI. Okay. So I'm the last person to tell anybody how to do their job, but these are just some things to take, think about when you're talking and working with veterans. You're already doing a big part of it by joining us for these classes, so being military cultural competent. And also another takeaway is, try not to share personal views on war and politics, and just, listen more. You guys know, and I know that you're all probably trained very well on this. Consider the loss of identity and focus on transition and ongoing reintegration. Okay. And know that there's a lot of stuff out there to help veterans. Our organization, there's so much out there. So again, if you don't necessarily know what to do, there's plenty of people out there that are willing to help and get these people back on the right path. And again, guys, if you need to call me, if you need to email me, please do. I'm here and I'll do everything I can to help you out. Okay, so that was veterans in general. And this is combat veterans, okay? So ones that have experienced combat. Try to avoid things like saying you understand if you haven't experienced it yourself. Okay, try to get them in a primary support system because they're used to that camaraderie that they have. And again, refer to other professionals as appropriate. All right, so that's it for me, guys. I just want to leave you with, I can't say thank you enough for everything that you all do. I'm newer to this field. I transitioned right into it after the military, but being around people like you has really been an inspiration, and it's made me a better person being around the human services field and helping these veterans out. And again, I'm here to help you in any way that you can, and I can't say thank you enough for taking the time to listen to what we have to say today, and I wish you all the very best. And Ms. Coastie, that's all I have.
Thank you, Jonathan. I actually have one question for you.
Okay,
We
yes,
had
ma'am.
one individual that asked us, they mentioned that they work at the courts in DC,
Okay.
and they want to know how your agency works with their military veteran clinic or the Easter Seals Clinic for Justice-Involved Veterans.
Yes, ma'am. So a lot of the deals that we have with Easter Seals, like even though I work with incarcerated veterans, I don't take away from anybody else from doing the job. It's a group effort. So I may be working with a veteran, but I have referred folks to Easter Seals all the time to get help. So not only am I helping them, but I'll refer them out to Easter Seals to get that help. So we closely work with them. In the DC VA Medical Center and Criminal Justice, I sit on dockets, things like dockets, and go to reentry council meetings. And we always try to connect the veteran to the federal services first, but if for some reason they don't qualify for those services is when we kind of play a bigger role into that. And I don't know if that would answer your question, but that's how we work with both.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yes, ma'am.
We appreciate that. And hold on one second. I think we have one other question.
Okay.
It says, do you always tell veterans that you're a veteran, or do you wait till you gain their trust?
Usually with me, what I've experienced, they've been able to tell right away, but I do come out with that because I found that it makes them feel comfortable. But what I try to avoid is, I am there to help them. So I listen to what they have to say and what they're struggling with, and I try to refrain from telling my own personal story because it's not about me when I'm working with them, it's about them. But there are some times where I share my stories like I did with you guys just now because I found that that's helped. But um, I've had people come in here and knowing that I'm a veteran, they just feel so much more comfortable knowing that they're talking to a veteran. So yes, to answer your question, yes, I usually, if they can't figure it out, but as soon as they walk into my office, I do initially like, hey, I understand, I'm a veteran as well, and that usually helps me have them open up and be able to help them a lot more.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yes,
We
ma'am.
appreciate, your time today and sharing more information about military culture and transition awareness. Thank you for that helpful insight, and we appreciate your time again today. And with that, I'm going to introduce you guys to your next speaker. We're going to have Dr. Paula Dominici with the Center of Deployment Psychology, who will be providing a more intensive training on moral injury in veterans. Paula is the Director of Training Education at the Center of Deployment Psychology, or CDP, at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Services in Bethesda, Maryland. She oversees the development of courses and training programs for providers on evidence-based treatments for service members and veterans. She also presents workshops on deployment behavioral health topics for civilians across the country. Dr. Dominici specializes in trauma and the treatment of PTSD using prolonged exposure therapy. When she first joined CDP in 2006, she worked at the National Naval Medical Center in the outpatient clinic and inpatient casualty care unit. Early in her career, she was APA Congressional Fellow, as well as a staff psychologist at the San Francisco VA Medical Center. She has co-authored 2 self-help books for troops returning from Iraq and Afghanistan and their families, including parents whose sons and daughters have served. If you give me just 1 second, we're going to switch over to her slide presentation.
Okay, are you able to see me, Christy?
Yes,
Okay,
we've got
great.
you.
All right, thank you. So welcome to the second part of this webinar. Today, I'm going to be talking about moral injury in our service members and veterans, as was mentioned. And as Christy also just said, I'm a psychologist working for the Center for Deployment Psychology, and at the CDP, which is what we call ourselves, our main goal is to train mental health providers like many of you in the audience who work with our service members and their families, so you know best practices and you can best meet their psychological needs. I do want to mention this disclaimer whenever we give presentations for the CDP. I just want to make it clear that today I'll express my views and they don't reflect the opinions of the Uniformed Services University or the Department of Defense or the US government. I also want to mention that today when I use the term service members, I'm referring to all type of military connected personnel, including the active duty component, the Guard and Reserve, as well as veterans. And it's great that you just got that comprehensive background from Jonathan to kind of set the stage as we dive into the topic of moral injury. I also want to really invite you to engage in this webinar. I know we don't have chat, but as much as possible, jot down questions and feel free to ask me questions at the end, and I'll make sure you have my email so we can stay in touch. As you all probably know, moral injury is a controversial topic. There's a variety of definitions for it. Some people have described it as soul wounds or bruises. Others have referred to it as damage to one's moral compass. For some, the term conveys placing judgment on a person's morality and therefore can be found to be very offensive. Undoubtedly, we know that the concept is still really difficult to define. There's not a consensus among the experts in the field. Since moral injury is not a diagnosis in the DSM-5, it can be hard to distinguish from other mental health problems, including PTSD, which I know Jonathan referred to a little bit earlier. Bottom line, there are still many questions surrounding moral injury. With this background in mind, the goals of the presentation today are what you see here on the slide. The goal is to help specify the key elements of a comprehensive definition of moral injury, to discriminate between characteristics of moral injury and other mental health problems like PTSD. And finally, I want to discuss possible strategies for assessing and treating moral injury to help service members heal. The concept of moral injury has received increased attention over the past decade, and you may have noticed that during the past decade. In fact, research articles and books on moral injury have in fact proliferated. This includes articles on the reference list I gave you. There's a ton there, and there's many more that are in the literature. There's also been a variety of books written on the topic, like the book by David Woods that's called What Have I Done? It's also being raised in the popular press, including testimonials written by service members themselves that can be very compelling. Indeed, moral injury has gained interest in different fields, not just the mental health care field. It's being discussed in spiritual and faith communities, philosophical circles and in the general public, which is all a good thing. While the examination of moral injury has increased dramatically over the past several years, I think you all know this, the concept has been around for a very, very long time. And Dr. Jonathan Shea, who's a real expert on moral injury, he's been studying it for several years. He traces it all the way back to the Trojan War described in the Greek poem, the Iliad, from the 8th century BC. Dr. Shea notes that the idea of moral injury is actually as old as war itself, although the term moral injury wasn't used. Some people speculate that the increased focus on moral injury over the past decade may relate to the extended operations in Iraq and Afghanistan that our military members encountered and the unprecedented number of deployments they experienced, which I know Jonathan just spoke about. During those wars, as he mentioned, it can be argued that that use of the unconventional guerrilla warfare may have put service members at increased risk for developing moral injury because they are exposed perhaps to greater ambiguity or uncertainty for longer periods of time. As Jonathan mentioned, this unconventional guerrilla warfare includes things like improvised explosive devices or IEDs, not knowing who the enemy was, changing rules of engagement, and challenges discerning the combatant from the non-combatant. All of those elements may have presented service members with potential morally or ethically challenging circumstances. As we kick off our discussion about moral injury, let's read an account by Tessa Pope, which you see here on the slide. She served in the Army National Guard as a military police officer for 7 years and was deployed to Afghanistan in 2010. This is actually what she recounts, and it's a very moving piece. This is what she says. One morning, I stood guard on the edge of our camp in Kunar province, Afghanistan. Scanning the area below my position, I noticed a boy about 7 years old and a young man, maybe 17 or 18, walking by a nearby house. My instincts told me something was wrong, so I raised my rifle to study them through my scope. I noticed the little boy had bare feet. I'll never forget that. It was morning still, but the heat was rising. The humidity stuck to my skin. I watched the young man lead the boy to a set of steps outside the house. I couldn't tell at first why or what was happening, my mind suspended in disbelief, but soon I realized the young man was raping the 7-year-old boy. I dropped my rifle to my side, my heart racing, confused, disgusted, and torn. But suddenly I raised it again, my index finger quivering on the trigger. I exhaled, focusing on the target like we were taught to do. I don't know how long I stood there, locked on his chest with my rifle, contemplating taking a young man's life. I wanted to kill him, but I thought, what if they're brothers? What will the blowback be? Will I go to prison? Those questions lingered for what seemed like hours. A sickening feeling rose from somewhere deep in my stomach up into my throat and rested there. The knot would stay for days, weeks, months, years. I didn't shoot the man, really a boy himself, but neither did I shout or scream. I did nothing. This testimonial illustrates how failure to act or witnessing something bad can contribute to moral injury. Moral injury doesn't only stem from acts of violence or perpetration, but also from inaction. And as a clinician, I've heard many service member stories like Tessa's that involve guilt or regret from witnessing something horrific and not taking action, not doing something. As Tessa's story depicts, service members' experiences may be rife with traumatic or life-altering circumstances, some that may deeply offend or defy their beliefs and values, and that can have big consequences for them. I know that Jonathan talked about some of these guiding ideals found on this slide. As you see, the warrior ethos is kind of defined by these guiding principles, things like selflessness, loyalty, and stoicism. And these all have the potential to give service members the strength to persevere through traumatic events and to help them navigate through very tough situations like Tessa's that we just heard. But at the same time, these principles may become vulnerabilities when service members feel that they or others haven't lived up to them. Bad things can happen to put service members in awful binds, events that end up contradicting these military ideals. circumstances they confront in which all available options in that moment have terrible consequences. As a result, some service members come to feel emotions like guilt or shame, betrayal, or a deep sense of frustration. Thus, living by the warrior ethos can be a double-edged sword. As one military physician, Dr. Wayne Jonas, so aptly explains, as you see on this slide, most people enter military service with the fundamental sense that they are good people and that they're doing this for good purposes. But things happen in war that are irreconcilable with the idea of goodness and benevolence, creating real cognitive dissonance. I'm a good person, and yet I've done bad things. For some, and again, it's only a subset of individuals, this struggle, this internal conflict about one's sense of humanity and what's right versus wrong may result in a moral injury that tears at their heart and soul for days and weeks, years, even a lifetime, as you heard from the National Guard soldier, Tessa. So what is moral injury? I know I've been talking about it, alluding to it. Take a minute and jot down on a piece of paper what moral injury means to you. Or how would you talk about it with a client? Go ahead and jot that down. What would be your definition of moral injury? Keeping your ideas in mind, let's consider some formal definitions that are cited in the literature. According to Dr. Jonathan Shea, who I mentioned earlier is a subject matter expert on this topic, moral injury is a character wound stemming from betrayal of justice by someone who holds authority in a high-stakes situation. An example may be when a platoon leader orders a Marine to leave an injured buddy behind, and he or she obeys, but this violently contradicts everything that Marine was taught. Other experts like Dr. Brett Litz and Dr. Shira Magwin describe moral injury as is shown at the bottom left. They describe it as emotional dissonance or inner conflict that results from acts or inactions that violate or transgress deeply held ideals, ethics, or expectations. These events can include perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that intensely turn upside down a person's fundamental beliefs about how the world operates or how people should be treated. An example of Dr. Litz's definition could be when a soldier shoots an enemy target, knowing that a child is strapped to that enemy's back as a human shield. An act that completely contradicts that soldier's view of himself or herself as a good person and leads to emotional anguish. According to Dr. Shea, these two definitions that you see on this slide really differ in who the violator is. In his definition, in the upper right, the violator is another person with authority over the victim, whereas in the second definition on the bottom left, the transgressor is actually oneself. Yet Dr. Shea explains that these two types of moral injury can coexist, or one may lead to another. Another definition of moral injury cited in the literature is on this slide. Mr. Jeremy Jinkerson, cited in the left there, describes it as a particular type of trauma syndrome that emerges after a person has been exposed to a morally injurious event where they perceive a violation of their beliefs or a break in trust by others, leading to dissonance. According to this definition, as you see on the slide, core symptoms include guilt, shame, spiritual conflict, or loss of trust. Secondary symptoms include responses like depression or anxiety, anger, self-harm, isolation, or even intrusive thoughts and images. Based on this definition, again by Jeremy Jinkerson, to be identified with moral injury, an individual must show a history of exposure to a morally injurious event, and then guilt, and at least two additional symptoms. Mr. Jinkerson's criteria, which you see here, while clear and very well defined, may seem to pathologize moral injury as a syndrome. Therefore, for some people, they feel uncomfortable with it. In 2017, the former Navy psychiatrist, who's also a subject matter expert on moral injury, Dr. Bill Nash, I heard him speak, and he summarized moral injury as damage to the whole person caused by a violent or consuming contradiction of moral expectations. In some cases, the person's integrity, core sense of self, even their personality is broken. And interestingly, Dr. Nash points out that there's a biological basis to this, that there is science supporting that we are breakable, that our cells and soul can be broken. He further describes that moral injury can occur when a person is a perpetrator, a recipient, or a witness of a contradicting act, as I mentioned earlier. Dr. Nash also suggests that moral injury can happen on a continuum from mild to severe. Moral pain, like physical pain, can fall on that spectrum. The pain isn't related to bodily injury, though, but rather damage to deeply held beliefs that undergird a person's sense of humanity. According to Dr. Nash, on the severe end, moral injury may even feel like a permanent amputation. This slide and the next one highlight two cases of moral injury, one that represents mild moral injury and the other severe moral injury. So on this slide, let's go ahead and talk about the case of Alex Horton. He was in the Army. He was out on patrol when the Army striker ahead of his vehicle ran over an IED, knocking that striker on its side. Everyone in that vehicle was injured. So apparently Alex and the rest of his unit quickly moved to secure the area until his wounded peers were evacuated. This included firing at the enemy to try to stop them. In the middle of the firefight, Alex shot a man twice in the abdomen. He saw that man struggle, but he couldn't see what happened next. He never knew what happened to him. The incident lasted only a few seconds. Alex shot at the man because in the midst of this firefight, he was trying to protect his peers. Alex thought that the unarmed man was acting kind of strange and in a threatening way, so he made it a choice to pull the trigger at that moment and thought it was the right thing at that moment. However, in hindsight, Alex believes he made the wrong decision. He beats himself up because he thinks he should have realized that a true insurgent wouldn't have been dumb enough to run across the street. So Alex tells him things like, "That's not how good people act, but I did it because I had to." Alex currently is not suffering from a debilitating mental health problem. He has a good career. Nonetheless, he experiences moral injury as a feeling of self-doubt and self-criticism that is always humming in the background, sort of like psychological tinnitus. Alex's case seems to represent mild moral injury. Now let's review the story of Noah Pierce, who was a 23-year-old Army infantryman diagnosed with PTSD once he got home from Iraq. As you see on the slide, it gives some background about him. During his deployment, he ran over an Iraqi child in a vehicle, and afterwards he wrote an email to his parents in which he said, "I feel really bad, but I thought he would get out of my way." Later on deployment, he shot the driver of a car that failed to slow down at a checkpoint. Then he learned it was a doctor, not an insurgent. He wrote a note to the doctor begging for forgiveness. He said, I'm sorry, can you ever forgive me?" In another incident, Noah implies shooting an Iraqi soldier at point blank range and feeling deep, deep regret. In a letter to his parents, he wrote, "Say you shoot out of an instinct like hunting. Then after you realize what you did, is that considered murder?" Back home, Noah ends up killing himself by a gunshot to the head. His suicide states, as you see on the slide, "Time's finally up. I'm not a good person. I've done bad things. I've taken lives. Now it's time to take mine." Noah appeared to be tortured by these incidents. He seemed convinced that his soul had become corrupted. For me, this case represents a severe moral injury. What we find is that in more severe forms, moral injury may be accompanied by self-destructive behaviors like suicide. So we've been discussing different military cases of moral injury. This slide and the next one lists combat-related situations cited in the literature that have the potential to inflict moral injury. The list is obviously not exhaustive, and service members may be faced with a combination of these kinds of events. So let's just review some of them. And I've already mentioned some earlier. Acts of violence or cruelty, including killing civilians or non-insurgents, like we heard from NOAA peers. Witnessing cruel or inhumane acts. Being exposed to human remains and dead bodies. Seeing injured women and children and not being able to help. Or seeing a buddy get blown up and freezing in shock and not being able to do anything. Leadership failures and betrayals by those in high authority or even peers can lead to moral injury. Other examples include failing to protect a service member from harm, including sexual assault, or failing to protect a child, like we heard in the case of Tessa when that boy was getting raped. Other examples include unintentional errors that lead to bad results, like the loss of life, surviving when a comrade is killed and feeling survivor's guilt. And even most recently, we're hearing about examples where drone operators seem to be experiencing moral injury. They can experience moral injury from their work on computers far away from the battlefield, when they watch images of explosions and see the carnage and aftermath on their screens after a drone strike. So there's a lot of different examples of potential morally conflicting events. It's important to note that moral injury can affect civilians too. While this talk is focused on service members and veterans, obviously moral injury can apply to non-military circumstances as well. For example, it's been studied in healthcare providers, educators, refugees, and child protective service workers. I do want to emphasize that merely because somebody has been exposed to a morally injurious circumstance, like some of the ones described here, it doesn't mean that they're going to develop moral injury. Some individuals may, some individuals may not. Let's go ahead and watch a video of a Gulf War veteran who describes his moral injury and what caused it when he was in the Marines. And when he served, he was a military photographer during the Gulf War.
Because of my moral injury, I went to the Gulf War. As a participant in the Gulf War, I was witness to, not directly, but when the aircraft came back and they offload the videos from the aircraft in the ready room, and they put the videos up, and so they're showing the actual mission that just occurred minutes before, and some of those missions. And when I say this, I don't put any judgment on this, but the missions, they did what they're supposed to do. They're taking out targets, which happen to be people. But we're watching this take place and actually watching people enjoying this. I was witness to people enjoying that. It was like watching a video game in a way, but they were taking out their targets, which happened to be humans, and it was hard to watch. It was just really hard for me to watch. And what made it even harder to watch was that they seemed to enjoy it. Of course, they were successful in their missions, and there might be pride in the work that you're doing, but for me, it was enjoying taking people's lives, and that was hard for me to accept. And I understand that one way to deal with taking people's lives would be to be thick-skinned about it, to put on this face of bravado, or, isn't this great, look what we just did. But it was hard for me. I mean, I just would have hoped that there would have been somebody would have, stepped up and said, this isn't fun, it's not good. I mean, those are people that we're killing that have children and families too. So that part stuck with me, and it was very hard for me to reconcile when I came home. I don't think I had the courage to do that. I don't think I had the courage to stand up in that room and say, stop. The entire room was moving with it, and maybe, again, it's a necessary mechanism for them to do their mission. I don't know that. I wasn't put in that situation, so I don't know. But I instantly felt it was wrong. It took my...
So you got cut off there at the end, but what he said was, I instantly felt it was wrong to my core when he's talking about the development of his moral injury. Most service members can reconcile these kinds of traumatic or morally conflicting events because of things like good training, preparation, and strong leadership. They can put into context what has happened and gradually move forward with their life. Unfortunately, however, some service members, like the veteran that you just heard from, they can't, and they're left with internal scars. They agonize and experience mental health consequences that may be characterized as moral injury. Some examples of mental health consequences are shown here on the slide. They've been associated with the notion of moral injury in the literature. We've already discussed some of these. For example, Dr. Alison Vargas and her colleagues who looked at data from Vietnam veterans identified loss of trust, spiritual issues, shame and guilt, self-deprecation, and other social and psychological symptoms as being associated with moral injury. Dr. Jonathan Shea has written that suicide, interpersonal violence, crime, and even incarceration are possible outcomes of moral injury when it goes unhealed. Others, like Dr. Brett Litz, who I was talking about earlier, have identified possible consequences related to moral injury as alienation, demoralization, self-loathing, hopelessness, as well as self-harming or reckless behaviors such as substance abuse or cutting. They suggest that most problematic can actually be the enduring changes in beliefs about oneself and others. For example, beliefs related to moral injury may be self-statements like, I'm a bad person, I'm toxic, or I'm evil, or I deserve to be punished for what I did. With respect to suicidal behavior and moral injury, let's look at this study from 2014. It was by Dr. Annabelle Bryan and her colleagues. They found that military personnel with a history of suicide attempts as compared to military personnel with no such history, reported higher levels of two types of moral injury. The first, moral injury stemming from witnessing others make transgressions, and the second, moral injury stemming from making transgressions oneself. So it may be that moral injury and actually specific types of it are a risk factor for suicidal ideation and suicide attempts when it's on the severe side of the spectrum, as we heard in the case of Noah Pierce earlier. Doctors Foy and Drescher, referenced on the bottom of the slide, they emphasize that loss of faith and guilt, as well as negative religious coping, are psychosocial spiritual consequences of moral injury, which I know we've been talking about. Examples of negative religious coping would be, let's say, when a person questions God's presence and develops negative thoughts, like God is punishing for my sins. Or on the flip side, the person develops outrage towards God and cuts off their faith because of the moral injury. Lack of forgiveness or unforgivability, that's in the blue there, I have found is a very big issue that may be at the core of some moral injuries. For patients I've seen with moral injury, their inability to forgive themselves or even to consider the possibility of forgiving themselves has been a major barrier, preventing them from moving forward and keeping them feeling tortured inside. You can see from my quick overview of moral injury over the past half an hour that there are a variety of morally challenging events and mental health and spiritual consequences associated with them. This makes pinning down and defining moral injury difficult. In 2016, Drs. Frankfurt and Fraser, again referenced here at the bottom, they conducted a literature review on the topic of moral injury, and they concluded what you see here on the slide. What they said was that research on transgressive acts and moral injury is complicated by a lack of conceptual clarity regarding definitions, causes, mechanisms, and outcomes. They argued that more research is needed. More recently, actually, in June of this past year, another group of researchers performed a comprehensive review of 116 articles on moral injury. They also concluded that the literature on this topic is full of problems related to internal and external validity. For example, they pointed out limitations like the lack of a consensus about the definition. As we've been discussing, they note the limitation that there's disagreement about what constitutes a morally injurious event, and there's the lack of a psychometrically sound measure of moral injury, among many other things. So until we agree on a clear definition of moral injury and address these shortcomings, obviously identifying this condition in clients like service members can be difficult for us as therapists. Nonetheless, I think opening the door so clients feel free to talk about moral injury and spending time exploring and assessing it, it can end up helping us develop more comprehensive clinical pictures for or about our patients, and therefore we can develop more appropriate treatment plans. This ultimately is a good thing because it will benefit our clients and their emotional well-being. But talking about moral injury is tough, as you can tell, as we've already been talking about during this webinar. Let's discuss challenges we face when it comes to having a conversation about moral injury with clients. First, we may not feel adequately trained to deal with moral injury or spiritual concerns, and we think we might need to refer clients to, let's say, a faith-based counselor or a spiritual leader. We may not think that moral injury falls in our so-called therapy lane. Or we may worry about being vicariously traumatized. So we send signals to our clients that we can't tolerate listening to war-related events involving things like suffering or atrocities. In some instances, we may think we need to report something if what we heard sounds like a war crime. Or I know for myself, we may be concerned that if we ask about moral injury, it will interfere with or even damage the therapeutic alliance. And service members themselves often worry we will judge them or not understand. They may feel uncomfortable or too ashamed to self-disclose in the first place. So these are just a few barriers that may keep us from having a dialogue with clients about possible moral injury. In addition to these challenges, moral injury often co-occurs with other problems, as you see on this slide. This makes it difficult to identify or flesh out. Moral injury can be masked by these other issues. In some cases, moral injury may be primary, with other problems glomming onto it or evolving out of it, in fact. For example, family issues, substance use problems, anger issues, depression, or spiritual struggles, which we've been talking about. In other cases, PTSD may be primary, and moral injury or other problems may be secondary. In particular, I've seen service members with both PTSD and moral injury, and I've often addressed the PTSD first with prolonged exposure therapy, which we'll talk about later. By using prolonged exposure therapy for the PTSD, gradually we've been able to uncover the moral injury and then work on it. To illustrate how difficult it can be to identify moral injury in a client, I want to introduce you to a military case found in the literature. So let's go ahead and talk about Sergeant First Class Marshall Powell. On this slide is a brief description about him. He was a soldier working in a hospital in Iraq after a bombing. As a nurse, he was helping injured Iraqis who were severely wounded, many who had little chance for surviving. At one point, he apparently saw a small girl in pain, and she reminded him of his niece. Her chest was blown apart, and she was suffering horribly. To alleviate her suffering, he gave her more and more painkiller medication. He kept pushing dose after dose of morphine into her IV to help alleviate that suffering. Apparently, she smiled at him and he smiled back. Then she took her last gasp of air and died. Thereafter, Sergeant First Class Powell comes to blame himself for her death. He's haunted by this incident if you read an article that talks about him. He's anguished with horrible guilt, believing he killed her by giving her too much morphine. Let's say that this soldier has separated from the military. He is now a veteran, and he comes to you for help. I want you to consider how you would know if he were struggling with a moral injury. Take a few seconds to reflect on that. For example, how would you know? How would you know he has a moral injury? What assessments, if any, would you use, or any out there, to tap into moral injury? What questions would you ask? How would you raise it? Would you even bring it up? Think about that for a second. So one of the obvious questions becomes, are there actual screens or measures to assess for moral injury? Go ahead and jot down on a piece of paper whether you think there are measures and screening tools that are specifically to identify moral injury. Jot down yes or no. What do you think? Maybe some of you are familiar with this. I know when I began looking into moral injury, I did not know if there was an assessment for it. The answer is yes, actually, but it's tricky. There are measures to assess how much a client has experienced morally conflicting events. That is, they assess the amount of exposure they've had to morally injurious situations. But these instruments can be confusing because they sometimes mix in items about mental health consequences the client is experiencing from those events. The double-barreled questions can conflate what is being measured. More specifically, it's not clear from some of these screens if you're assessing the amount or frequency that the client has experienced morally injurious events, or if you're assessing the type and severity of mental health symptoms stemming from those experiences, which in fact are two separate things. Let's go ahead and look at some of the screens and measures we do have for moral injury, recognizing that they have limitations and need further refinement. One of these measures is the Moral Injury Event Scale, or MIES, that was developed in active duty troops in 2013 by Dr. Bill Nash, who I mentioned earlier. And you have a copy of this in your handouts, and we've gotten permission to share it with you. It's actually public domain. The Moral Injury Event Scale, or MIES, assesses a person's exposure to military events that have the potential to challenge their moral beliefs and assumptions. It captures moral injury events on two subscales, as you see on the screen. Perceived transgressions by oneself or others, and then perceived betrayal by others. So it's nice that it has those two subscales. The MIES uses a 6-point Likert scale ranging from 1, which represents strongly disagree, to 6, which reflects strongly agree. Higher scores on the MIES suggest that the client has had a greater intensity of exposure to morally conflicting events. Let's look at some examples from the MIES. I'll show these on the screen here. For example, one of the items is, I saw things that were morally wrong. Another item is I violated my own morals by failing to do something I felt I should have. And a third example is I feel betrayed by leaders who I once trusted. And again, the individual endorses how much they agree or disagree with the different items on the scale. Another measure is called the Moral Injury Questionnaire, the military version, or the MIQ-M. It also was developed in 2013, and you have a copy of this in your handouts. Like the MIS that we just reviewed, the MIQ-M shown here was designed to assess the frequency with which a service member has experienced morally conflicting events. The client rates 19 items on a 4-point scale ranging from 1, which represents never, to 4, which represents often. Higher scores suggest a greater exposure to morally challenging events, not the mental health consequences of moral injury. Let's look at some sample items from the MIQ-M. For example, one item reads, I did things in war that betrayed my personal values. Another one says, seeing so much death has changed me. And a third example reads, I made mistakes in the war zone that led to injury or death. And again, the individual filling out the questionnaire rates on that 4-point scale how much this represents them in terms of their exposure to those types of events. And what you see here is a newer measure, and it's called the Moral Injury Symptom Scale, the military version short form. It was published just in 2018, so it's newer. You also have a copy of this in your handouts. The original long version of this scale was studied in active duty service members and veterans with PTSD. It was developed to screen for moral injury and to monitor responses to PTSD treatment. The short form consists of 10 items, which the client responds to on a scale from 1 to 10. 1 suggests strongly disagree, and 10 suggests strongly agree. On this scale, higher scores indicate more symptoms of moral injury, including psychological and spiritual symptoms. So you get a sense how this measure actually is focusing more on the consequences of morally injurious events, whereas the other 2 that we just reviewed did not do that. While this scale shows promise, it's still relatively new and needs to be validated further. Let's go ahead and review some sample items from the Moral Injury Symptom Scale. For example, one of the questions is, I feel betrayed by leaders who I once trusted. I feel ashamed about what I did or did not do during this time. I feel guilt over failing to save the life of someone in war. All 3 of these measures we've just reviewed can be used to invite a conversation about moral injury or to serve as a guide for exploring moral injury. They don't need to be used as assessments per se, so I'd encourage you to look at those measures, and then you can kind of pull out some of the items to begin a conversation with clients to talk about potential moral injury. Keep in mind, though, that assessing cause and effect in the same assessment can imply connections between the 2 that may not be valid. In other words, measuring a person's exposure to transgressive or morally conflicting acts is distinct from measuring the effects or outcomes of that exposure. In fact, researchers have pointed out that most studies to date have assessed exposure to morally injurious events or situations as a proxy for morally injurious outcomes, which isn't the same thing. Other researchers have suggested it may be helpful to separately assess witnessing transgressive acts from committing transgressive acts from experiencing betrayals. On this slide and the next one are a list of questions that you could ask a service member to start a conversation about moral injury. You have a handout of them as well. These are suggestions based on my clinical experience and my colleagues' clinical experience. They're not part of an official measure, but we think they may be helpful to you. For example, you might say, when I talk to other service members, they often describe losses they experienced while in theater. Do you have similar losses? Another way you could frame it is, do you have nagging thoughts or regrets about your deployment or joining the military that you can't seem to shake off? Or have you begun to rethink your beliefs about spirituality, faith, or religion since returning from your deployment? I won't read all of these because, again, you have a handout with these questions, but a couple others that you can consider asking include, have you been questioning decisions or events that happened in theater? Or some service members describe feeling a sense of blame, guilt, or shame over something they did or didn't do while they were in combat. Can you relate to this? Again, you have this list of questions as a handout and can use them as a guide, as well as the 3 measures I reviewed. So I hope you'll find those helpful. What are other important factors to keep in mind when discussing moral injury? Because of the negative self-judgment, guilt, and regret often associated with moral injury, it's really important for therapists to elicit conversations with clients about moral injury. Some service members may not even recognize an event as having caused moral injury. So bringing it up reassures them that you can handle it and that you aren't there to judge them. It's critical to build trust and to create an environment where the service member obviously feels safe and not criticized when you're exploring these types of questions. It's also really important to give the service member the space and time they need to share at their own pace and discretion, while also not colluding with their desire not to talk about it. Ultimately, I believe they need to open up about it in order to heal. I know Jonathan talked about PTSD, so let's look more closely at it and kind of compare it to moral injury to help us better understand some distinctions between the two. As you know, and as you heard earlier, PTSD on the left there is defined by the DSM-5, obviously, as a mental health disorder where there are established criteria, and the triggering event, as you all know, involves actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. A person no longer needs to respond to the triggering event with fear, horror, or helplessness, as was the case with the DSM-4, as you will recall. This was a fairly big change made in the DSM-5 when they were reissuing the criteria for PTSD. To meet the threshold for PTSD, an individual must have lingering symptoms, which we'll go over in just a second, that persist for over a month, and they must be impacting or impairing their functioning and their quality of life. Moral injury, on the other hand, shown on the right, is considered to be a dimensional construct with no established criteria. And as we've been talking about, there's not a diagnosis for it in the DSM-5. For moral injury, the triggering event involves a perceived transgression that violates the person's moral, spiritual, or ethical code. as we've been mentioning, scholars suggest that a moral injury results from perpetrating or witnessing events that transgress deeply held values, or from a betrayal by a trusted authority figure. Examples of symptoms common to both PTSD and moral injury include these that I'm showing you: intrusive symptoms like flashbacks, avoidance of trauma reminders and trauma memories, numbing, withdrawal, negative changes in a person's thoughts or mood, things like self-blame, guilt, or shame, along with reckless or self-destructive behavior, as well as anger. Those are some common symptoms that we may see in both PTSD and moral injury. This obviously is not an exhaustive list of overlapping symptoms between the two. As the DSM-5 has moved the diagnosis of PTSD out of the anxiety disorders category and into the category known as trauma and stressor-related disorders, as Jonathan mentioned, it seems like the distinctions between PTSD and moral injury may be less clear. The broader, more encompassing DSM-5 definition of PTSD, for me, reflects a growing awareness that not everybody responds to a trauma with an anxious or fear-based reaction. Rather, the response can present more heterogeneously. Also, we know that individuals can struggle with both PTSD and moral injury. They aren't mutually exclusive, as I talked about earlier. Some researchers have stressed that they don't want to classify moral injury as a formal psychiatric diagnosis in the DSM-5 because it's pathologizing, which I noted before. Another possibility is to consider that there are different subtypes of trauma characterized by unique predominant emotional states. For example, maybe one subtype of trauma is more fueled by fear and anxiety, whereas another subtype of trauma is more propelled by guilt and shame. So it may be that there are different subtypes of trauma that then respond differently to different types of treatment. And that makes some sense to me, that characterization. However, from my perspective, something about the underlying fabric of moral injury does in fact seem different than PTSD, having worked with service members and veterans who struggle with it. This distinction is captured in this chilling poem, and perhaps some of you have read this before. It's called The Warrior's Dance, and it was written by Camilo Mac Baika, a former Marine who served in the Vietnam War and apparently spent years recovering from that experience. In this poem, he conveys how a service member's character has been corrupted by something horrific done during the war. This is what he writes. I fear I am no longer alien to this horror. I am the horror. I have lost my humanity and have embraced the insanity of war. The monster and I are one. So I dance, the dance of warriors, amidst decaying corpses and forsaken loved ones, I dance. I have feasted upon their flesh, and with their blood have quenched my thirst. The blood of innocence forever stains my soul. The transformation is complete. I can never return. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. What we hear in this moving poem is what I think the undoing of this service member's character. It's like it's a deterioration in his whole being, a staining of his soul, like he's turned into a monster, which is said. Some service members with moral injury come to feel toxic or evil. They even come to believe that they'll contaminate others. For me, it's this perceived hijacking of an individual's sense of humanity that seems to distinguish moral injury from PTSD. Also, as I mentioned, for me, there seems to be a deep sense of unforgivability when it comes to some moral injuries that may not be seen in PTSD. The comment on this slide is from a Vietnam veteran after he read a blog about moral injury, which one of my colleagues had written, and we posted it on the CDP website. It conveys just how validating and helpful it was for this Vietnam veteran to learn finally about moral injury. When he responded to her blog by saying, "Once the concept of moral injury was described to me, I realized it's what's been my problem all along. It had helped explain me to me and why I never wanted to talk about what I had experienced." Ultimately, being able to identify with moral injury seemed to have given this veteran greater understanding about himself. As clinicians, providing psychoeducation about the concept of moral injury can be incredibly validating to service members. That's what I found. Just talking about moral injury and putting a name to it can help them be a lot less critical of themselves. Let's talk about the treatment of moral injury now in kind of this last section of the talk. Recognizing, however, that it's hard to treat a problem that is not fully defined and that researchers and clinicians don't have a consensus about. For PTSD, we know which treatments work best, right? For those of you who are clinicians, based on the latest VA DoD clinical practice guideline for the management of PTSD noted at the bottom of this slide, and that was published in 2017, and is the most recent version we have. The first-line evidence-based psychotherapies, they're individual, manualized, trauma-focused approaches with a primary component of exposure or cognitive restructuring. Examples include therapies like prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is also referred to as EMDR, and then written exposure therapy, which isn't on the slide, and there's some others. But those are all considered the gold standard therapies to effectively treat PTSD, and they all are trauma focused. Many of you may actually be familiar with some or all of these, which is great. This slide outlines how cognitive processing therapy, or we call it for short CPT, how it can be used to address moral injury or aspects of moral injury, not just PTSD. CPT encourages clients to examine trauma-related beliefs, including shame, guilt, and culpability, where there may be cognitive errors. Cognitive therapy techniques are used in CPT to help clients develop more adaptive beliefs by targeting what they call stuck points. The goal is to promote moral repair by helping clients gain more balance in their thinking, for example, when it comes to moral injury. Like CPT, prolonged exposure therapy, or what we call PE, it also can be used to address moral injury or aspects of it. In PE, repeated exposures to internal and external trauma reminders allow clients to learn that the triggers and the memories aren't dangerous and that they can cope. Clients also learn that their anxiety decreases and they can tolerate the distress. As a result, they're able to process the trauma memory, and gradually they're able to modify cognitions related to their perceived moral transgressions. So for example, in PE, guilt-related moral injury, what I've seen is that it goes down by helping clients contextualize or kind of put in perspective their perceived moral violations, and it allows them to finally tap into some of those vulnerable emotions that they've been avoiding, and maybe those more vulnerable emotions have been masked by something like anger. Both prolonged exposure therapy and cognitive processing therapy help clients gain new information about the world and themselves. They are then able to move forward once they process the trauma memory and they gain a more realistic understanding of the morally challenging event, what their role was in it, and how they responded. When it comes to something like guilt, the goal is not to have clients shirk or erase or eradicate their responsibility for bad things they may have done or for things that they are truly culpable of, but rather the goal is to help them gain a fuller perspective and context. So for a service member struggling with moral injury, in some cases, what we're striving for them to do is to develop a more accurate appraisal of their sense of responsibility regarding their actions or their inactions during that morally injurious circumstance. Both CPT and PE have been found to lead to significant reductions in trauma-related guilt. And in my work with service members using prolonged exposure therapy, I definitely have found that over time the guilt goes down, the more that the individual is able to talk about the trauma and the feelings underlying it. So I believe you can address moral injury through evidence-based psychotherapies like PE, like CPT. And as I've been mentioning, I've used PE to do this with several service members with moral injury and had good results. However, there are some researchers that disagree with me on that front. There's some researchers who've suggested that evidence-based psychotherapies like PE and CPT, that they're not targeting the moral injury enough. That is, that those psychotherapies, things like PE and CPT and EMDR, they were primarily developed to target fear-based traumas, not morally based traumas. And thus, they may not explicitly treat the moral injury. For instance, Dr. Shira Magowin, who works at the San Francisco VA, and I've mentioned her name earlier, she works a lot with Dr. Brett Litz. She argues that evidence-based psychotherapies like PE and CPT, if used alone, may not sufficiently treat moral injury, especially if the trauma involves killing-based transgressions. So let's talk more about this. The good news is that beyond traditional evidence-based PTSD psychotherapies like CPT and PE and EMDR, which we've been talking about, some interventions are actually being tested or considered specifically to target moral injury. And perhaps some of you in the audience know of these, have heard of these, or are even using them. Some of these newer interventions, or ones that are targeting moral injury specifically, include adaptive disclosure, an intervention that's called Impact of Killing in War, or IOK, acceptance and commitment therapy, also known as ACT, which some of you may be quite familiar with, and then spiritually integrated approaches. I'll briefly go over each of these next. So let's go ahead and start with adaptive disclosure. This is actually an 8-session exposure-based approach. Dr. Brett Litz, who I've mentioned, earlier, he and his colleagues published this treatment in their 2016 manual, and it is referenced here at the bottom of my slide. It's called Adaptive Disclosure, a New Treatment for Military Trauma, Loss, and Moral Injury. It's interesting, this treatment originated out of work with Marines who were returning from combat and they had PTSD. When treating these service members, the clinicians happened to notice that for some, their traumas were not based on fear, but rather on perceived moral dilemmas or losses they had experienced downrange. For these service members, the clinicians found that traditional exposure treatment, like prolonged exposure therapy, wasn't addressing their problems sufficiently enough. So adaptive disclosure was developed to address 3 specific types of combat-related traumas. The authors break trauma types down into 3 categories. The first are traumas that are based on life threat or fear. The second are traumas that relate to loss and grief issues. And the third type of trauma are related, in fact, to moral injury. If the target trauma is based on life threat or fear, Brett Litz's team recommend that traditional exposure techniques can be used and they'll be effective. So just use prolonged exposure therapy, for example, as you usually would. However, if the target trauma derives, let's say, not from a fear-based event, but rather from loss and grief, the exposure protocol is changed. So there's a breakout session in which the client actually has an imaginary conversation with that lost person. So the traditional exposure techniques are modified for this breakout session. In a similar way, if the target trauma stems from a moral conflict, again, it's not from a fear-based trauma, the authors of this manual recommend, again, changing the regular exposure protocol. They call for a breakout session in which the client actually has an imaginary conversation with a compassionate moral authority figure or a person imagined to have confessed with what the client did. These breakout sessions are similar, I think, to using the empty chair technique, which some of you may be familiar with from Gestalt therapy. So you can see with adaptive disclosure, there's elements of traditional prolonged exposure embedded, and yet some of the techniques have been modified when in fact the trauma is more involving moral injury or loss and grief. Apparently the name adaptive disclosure was chosen for this therapeutic approach or for this treatment manual because the authors thought that it was less off-putting and less stigmatizing, while still suggesting that healing occurs by adaptively disclosing those traumatic memories. In terms of empirical research that has actually looked at and studied adaptive disclosure and how effective it is, several years ago, there was a study that was funded by the Navy in which 44 active duty Marines and Navy corpsmen at Camp Pendleton received the treatment or this intervention. The adaptive disclosure treatment wasn't expected to be better than prolonged exposure therapy or cognitive processing therapy for PTSD overall, but rather to more specifically address loss and moral injury if these were actually part of that service member's PTSD clinical picture. As you see on this slide, overall, the adaptive disclosure intervention based on this study seemed to work. You see that the researchers found significant reductions in PTSD and depressive symptoms. There also were improvements in post-traumatic cognitions, meaning that some of these rigid and extreme trauma-related cognitions became more flexible and less unhelpful. The effect sizes for PTSD, depression, and post-traumatic cognitions were large. And they also found an increase, interestingly, in post-traumatic growth, which was studied. Currently, from my review of the literature, there are 2 clinical trials being conducted at this time looking at adaptive disclosure. So two trials are underway. And then there's a 3rd study that is looking at using an expanded version of adaptive disclosure that actually incorporates compassion training, which is taught to the individual receiving the intervention. It also incorporates purposefully letter writing to work on issues around things like self-acceptance. So again, more to come with respect to adaptive disclosure. And if you are interested in this treatment, I encourage you to buy the manual. Once again, I'm noting it here on the bottom of this slide. And you also have this noted on the reference list that I gave you. So in addition to adaptive disclosure, which we were just talking about, Dr. Shira Magowin, who I mentioned works at the San Francisco VA and has done a lot of great work with veterans. She and her colleagues have been developing a cognitive behavioral therapy approach that consists of 6 to 8 weekly individual sessions. And her intervention is called the Impact of Killing in War, which I mentioned earlier, or IOK. So some of the basics about this intervention are noted on this slide. Dr. Magowin and her team have been studying the impact of killing in war treatment with veterans who have been impacted by killing in combat or who feel responsible for the death of others in combat. The premise is that therapists don't commonly assess for killing, and I think that's really true. I think myself included, many of us as clinicians or therapists don't want to go there. So unless it's really brought up to us, we don't specifically inquire about, killing behavior or acts of perpetration that that service member or veteran sitting before us may have engaged in. We don't tend to ask about it or its impact on veterans, even though veterans with higher killing experiences actually have been found to have increased mental health risks, including suicidal ideation. So we're really doing a disservice by not opening up the door to talk about killing. So the impact of killing in war treatment that Dr. Shira Magowin and her team has designed, it's used after a client has completed a trauma-focused therapy, whether that therapy was done individually or in a group format. So it's used after a veteran has already done some talking about their trauma. It's not the first intervention or treatment that's used. Although when that patient or client has engaged in the trauma-focused therapy, it doesn't have to first have been on their killing-related trauma. So the impact of killing in war intervention noted here, it's an adjunct treatment, and interestingly, it incorporates forgiveness, which we were talking about, as well as Gestalt, existential, and relational theories, specifically targeting thoughts about killing and the meaning of killing. Dr. Magowin and her group published the results from their first randomized controlled trial on this treatment in 2017. In that study, they gave the treatment. The treatment was done with 33 combat veterans, all of whom had PTSD, and all of them had completed a trauma-focused, evidence-based psychotherapy prior to getting her intervention. All of these veterans had experienced distress over killing or feeling responsible for the deaths of others in war. So very specifically, they had acts of perpetration during war that they had to stress over. As you see here, the veterans were randomized either to 6 to 8 weekly sessions of the impact of killing in war treatment. So 17 of the veterans got the IOK intervention. And then the other veterans, 16 of them, were in a 6-week waitlist condition, after which they would receive the impact of killing in war treatment. So those two treatments, the control condition was compared, or the waitlist condition was compared to the active treatment of IOK. What the researchers were hypothesizing in this study was that PTSD, general psychiatric symptoms, and interpersonal functioning would improve more in those who received the moral injury intervention. That is, veterans would benefit more if they got the IOK intervention compared to those who did not get it, who had only gotten the trauma-focused treatment. And that's actually what they found. Let's go ahead and review the results of this study. As you see here, the list on the left highlights the cognitive gains that were found in veterans who engaged in the impact of killing in war treatment sessions. Things like decreased thoughts about deserving to suffer due to an act of killing. They had improved cognitions about the ability to be close to others. They were more self-accepting, and they had more understanding of self-forgiveness, all of which were really positive findings. In addition, on the right, you see psychological and interpersonal gains for those who participated in the impact of killing in war intervention. For example, those veterans who received the intervention, they showed decreased PTSD symptoms and decreased general psychiatric symptoms, including decreased anxiety and OCD and depression, along with the PTSD, as I mentioned. They also showed increased participation in community events, suggesting they were connecting up more with others. And indeed, they reported more confiding of personal thoughts and feelings to others. So according to Dr. Magowin, if you read her research article about this study, she believes that her results provide evidence for the effectiveness of pairing moral injury interventions with PTSD treatment to improve healing. The veterans in her study indeed reported benefiting from the impact of killing in war treatment, and they found the treatment acceptable. So they were amenable to it, and they gained from it. If you want to learn more about the impact of killing in war treatment, Dr. Shira Magowin's work, you can read the article I've been referring to. It is also on your reference list, and it's called Impact of Killing in War, a randomized controlled pilot trial found in the Journal of Clinical Psychology. Let's next turn to acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, as a possible treatment for moral injury. I'm curious, some of you may be very familiar with ACT already. You may be using it for anxiety disorders or other issues, but I want to talk to you a little bit about how it may be a promising therapy for moral injury specifically. So ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy, has been shown to be effective in treating shame in general. And there's been an initial test of using ACT for moral injury that involved group therapy. It was 6 sessions, and the sessions were 75 minutes each. However, that was not a randomized controlled trial study. So currently, to my knowledge, there are no published randomized control trials of using ACT to treat moral injury yet, but I think they will be forthcoming. Nonetheless, it seems to have good potential for addressing moral injury because the goal of ACT is for clients to learn psychological flexibility and non-judgmental acceptance of their internal experiences. So the goal isn't to prevent or to stop the client from experiencing distress. For those of you who use ACT, you know, ACT encourages clients to face feelings like shame or guilt or regret that could be tied to moral injury. Clients are asked to identify what values have been violated by their perceived moral transgressions, and they're looking out at which values they cherish as a result. So if a therapist, let's say we're working with a service member who held the belief, I'm evil because I killed Iraqi children, one thing the therapist could do would be to use that belief as a window to help the client reflect on values they find important. For example, maybe a belief that's really important to them is children are precious or children need to be loved. The therapist would then help the client decide how they could intentionally pursue those values moving forward, despite the emotional pain associated with the moral injury. I was speaking to some folks who study moral injury and are working on like a think tank focused on it. And one of them mentioned that there's a book that's going to be published soon on using acceptance and commitment therapy with moral injury specifically. That was the first that I heard about that book that may be coming out soon. So I would be on the lookout for that if you're interested in how we could use ACT to treat moral injury in our service members and veterans. It sounds very promising. And also, if you want to learn more about ACT in the short term, you can read the article found on your reference list. It's by Dr. Nusma, and it's titled Possibilities with Acceptance and Commitment Therapy for Approaching Moral Injury, and it's from the Journal of Current Psychiatric Reviews, and that article was from 2015. Other approaches for helping service members recover from moral injury incorporate spiritually integrated components, and I think that makes a lot of sense given how we've been talking about some of the consequences of moral injury that include spiritual breaks or changes in one's faith and things like that. For some service members, in fact, moral injury becomes an uphill battle of spiritual soul searching that can leave them wrestling with questions like, how can God exist if such bad things happened? Or since I did such awful, horrific things in war, I deserve to be punished by God. And I know we were talking about that earlier. Experts in the field, people like Dr. Kent Drescher and Dr. Rita Brock, they recommend bridging the gap between spiritual and mental health care providers when working with service members with moral injury. They strongly advise collaboratively providing care that incorporates spiritual and religious practices, not just focusing on behavioral health care. An example of a spiritually integrated approach for targeting moral injury, and it's at the second one on the bottom bullet point here. An example is one called Spiritually Integrated Cognitive Processing Therapy, or SICPT. So it's a modified version of cognitive processing therapy, which we were discussing earlier. It consists of 12 sessions like standard CPT, but the sessions and the worksheets have been adapted to include spiritual distress, forgiveness, and things like spiritual partnerships and resources. It also, interestingly, has optional supplements covering world religions like Christianity and Islam and Buddhism. Another spiritual-oriented intervention is called Building Spiritual Strength. Also, you see that in the last bullet there. It's an 8-session group approach for specifically treating military sexual trauma survivors that promotes making meaning, and it may help address moral injury. The Building Spiritual Strength group approach and spiritually integrated cognitive processing therapy, both of these offer promise as interventions for moral injury, but both need to be further studied and validated. So remember the Army veteran we spoke of earlier who felt responsible for the death of a 6-year-old Iraqi girl who he gave pain medication to when she was suffering from a bomb injury? We were talking about the Army veteran Marshall Powell and how he was struggling deeply with moral injury. Let's say an evaluation was done that indicated his 2 primary conditions are PTSD and moral injury. Then he comes to you for treatment. What treatment would you use with him if you were his therapist? What type of approach do you think would help address his moral injury and his PTSD? Take a few minutes to jot down what your treatment plan would be, or sketch out what would be the treatment approach you would use with this Army veteran who is faced with that situation. Go ahead and think about the treatment you would consider using. Well, I can actually tell you what happened in terms of his treatment. This is written up in an article. I never knew this veteran, but the case is described in an article, and it's very interesting as we try to understand moral injury and treatment for it. So this Army veteran ended up being treated not at an Army medical center, but a Navy medical center in San Diego, which I'll go over in just a second. So as you heard earlier, the young girl's death left this Army veteran questioning God and struggling with a lot of guilt and regret. He was not doing well. He was struggling a lot. He eventually was prescribed medications for insomnia, for depression and anxiety, and he was seeing a therapist for PTSD on a weekly basis. But apparently these interventions weren't working. So finally, and fortunately, he was referred to the Navy Medical Center in San Diego to a specific residential program that I was mentioning earlier, and you see on the slide. This residential program is called OASIS, which stands for Overcoming Adversity and Stress Injury Support. This apparently is a program for patients who are treatment resistant for PTSD, or they're not finding success with their PTSD treatments. So luckily, this veteran found a home there. He was referred there. And at OASIS, he received individual counseling for PTSD and sleep issues, but he also participated in an adaptive disclosure therapy group. So we were talking about adaptive disclosure earlier, used in an individual therapy format, but for him, it was group therapy for 10 weeks. And again, this adaptive disclosure therapy group was focusing on moral injury specifically. The adaptive disclosure group apparently had 7 other veterans in it who had similar issues. They were similarly struggling with moral injury. In the adaptive disclosure group treatment, apparently this veteran comes to tell his story aloud about the little girl, the one that we briefly talked about earlier. And he writes a letter to the girl's parents as an intervention and as a means for helping him to begin to perhaps self-forgive. It becomes a letter of reconciliation to the girl's parents as a means towards self-forgiveness, as the slide said, even though he never sends the letter. Obviously, he doesn't know her parents. But writing this letter of reconciliation to the girl's parents, seemed to be really helpful for him, as did writing it down, putting his thoughts in words, and reading them aloud to his fellow veterans in the group. For example, he wrote, "I want you to know your daughter has been in my heart each day since that night." So according to the article, this veteran improved a great deal when he went to OASIS, to this residential program, where part of his treatment was through the adaptive disclosure group therapy. These next two slides summarize what we've been talking about over this webinar. They summarize what I think are basic treatment considerations for your clinical practice if you feel like you have a client who is wrestling with moral injury. So let's just walk through them. You can use the questions that you see here with your clients to help unpeel the role and impact of their traumas in their life, including possible moral injury. For example, you can begin by asking your client, what was the triggering traumatic event? What was their role at the time of that event? Were they a witness to what occurred or a recipient of some sort of action, or did they commit an act of perpetration or some act of violence? What are their predominant painful emotions? For example, are they more fear and based on a fear trauma, or are they more sadness or related to loss? Or are they related to a sense of betrayal? So they are experiencing feelings of, let's say, disillusionment or outrage or anger even. Are there feelings of disgust or helplessness or longing? Then you can consider what thoughts and beliefs were shaken up by that traumatic experience, which may have involved a moral conflict. Are they related to themes of moral conflict when you're talking about their self-statements and their cognitions? You can continue by trying to probe or explore unhelpful behaviors or coping strategies that developed after that triggering event, after that trauma that may have involved a moral or ethical challenge. Are they engaging in coping strategies that have gotten to the point of being self-destructive, like drinking or cutting or things like that? You can then ask some questions about how their relationships, their social interactions have been impacted. Are they withdrawing? Are they feeling alienated? For some, they may even feel ostracized by their community. What I think are really key here are these next two questions. What was lost? What is the main thing that the client sitting in front of you has lost as a result of that traumatic event, which may have a moral component to it? Was it a loss of trust that was thoroughly broken? Was it an attachment bond that was severed? Is it a sense of self that was destroyed or damaged? Is it a loss of dignity? Is it a loss of self-respect? Is it a loss of safety that has resulted from that life-altering event? And once we know what that primary loss is, and again, it may be a handful of things, we can talk about then what is needed and provide and try to help meet that need in the therapy. Is what they need more a sense of safety or trust or love or self-respect, or is indeed it's self-acceptance or self-forgiveness? And then, as we talked about earlier, it's always important to talk about any co-occurring problems, because we know PTSD and or moral injury often have other problems that accompany them. I know this is a busy slide, but I just want to use it to give specific examples as we summarize treatment considerations or way to talk about moral injury with our clients. You can explore beliefs, thoughts, and emotions your client may have related to moral injury by inviting a discussion in which you specifically explore their beliefs around themes related to harm to innocent people, beliefs and cognitions that relate to failing others, failing their unit, failing their command, failing the military, exploring beliefs and self-statements and thoughts that relate to betrayal by leadership or command or even peers, themes, cognitions tied to unfairness or injustice. Have a conversation about thoughts and self-statements your client has related to moral injury, such as, I'm evil, or I'm an awful human being, as you see here. Self-statements like, I'm weak, I should have done more, I'm a coward, it's all my fault. Or thoughts like, nobody can ever be trusted, everything the military taught me was a lie. Bad things shouldn't happen to good people. It doesn't matter how hard I try. You want to get at these thoughts and beliefs by exploring if they're tied to a moral conflict. In addition, non-judgmentally consider exploring moral-related emotions that your client may be experiencing. In simple terms, these can be broken down into two categories. The first category are those negative, painful emotions they are feeling that relate to themselves, like shame or embarrassment, guilt, self-blame, self-loathing, or remorse. The second category are those negative, painful emotions your client may be feeling about others, like contempt, or anger, or disgust, or disillusionment, or outrage. The beliefs, the thoughts, and the emotions outlined here and others like them can become the stepping stones for your therapeutic focus on moral injury. As we conclude this webinar, let's briefly talk about future directions. First, experts agree that more research is needed on moral injury. I know I've emphasized that. This research really needs to include more clearly defining the concept, how we measure it, among many other questions that we still have about moral injury. Second, raising our awareness, raising therapists' knowledge and awareness of moral injury through webinars like this is vitally important, as it obviously impacts treatment considerations and treatment success. We as clinicians need to be comfortable raising the issue and not passing judgment. This means considering moral injury and learning about it part of our professional growth and responsibility under our ethics code. It means learning to feel comfortable addressing religious and spiritual issues related to moral injury, and preparing ourselves for the discomfort of bearing witness to discussions that may involve violence, suffering, and atrocities. Additionally, hopefully you've heard the message in this webinar, how providing greater awareness and psychoeducation about moral injury to the service members, to the veterans, to our clients can bring potential relief and increase insights like self-understanding or even self-forgiveness, like we heard from that Vietnam veteran when he wrote, "I finally got it." Additionally, many experts in the field, like Dr. Bill Nash, Dr. Shea, Dr. Drescher, Dr. Brock, folks I've been mentioning, they recommend that a more integrated and holistic approach be used to address moral injury. It's an integrated approach that goes beyond just trauma-focused therapies. These integrated approaches invite spiritual, psychological, interpersonal, and societal interventions to help service members heal from moral injuries. They argue that this holistic approach needs to address the stigma of seeking help for moral injury, and that this integrative approach can incorporate adjunctive approaches, including things like art and music and mindfulness. An integrated comprehensive strategy also calls for increasing and extending community support to service members struggling with moral injury. What this means is getting communities involved, making it each of our obligation, each person's obligation and responsibility to offer service members moral support by opening up conversations and helping them regain a sense of safety, a sense of trust. We all need to recognize that moral injury isn't solely a product of an internal conflict. These moral challenging events and the consequences of them didn't happen in a vacuum. Moral injury likely requires more than individual psychotherapy to help service members and veterans heal. Finally, I just want to mention that on your reference list, I didn't put this article because I recently added some of it to the presentation, but I want you to be aware that it's a great article. It's called Moral Injury, an Integrative Review, found in the Journal of Traumatic Stress. It's from the June 2019 issue. It has a review of a lot of articles and gives an overview of the status of the research in the field as a whole. So I encourage you to read it. So that wraps up my presentation. I did want to, and I'll take questions in just a second, I did want to just tell you more about other resources the Center for Deployment Psychology offers. If you go to our website, www.deploymentpsych.org, which you see here, we have lots of upcoming training events. You'll see a tab for trainings. Some are online like this one, and some are in person. We also have blogs that are written on a range of really great content that you're more than invited to read, and other articles and resources on things like PTSD and TBI and insomnia, which I know both Jonathan and I have been talking about. I also wanted to emphasize that we have a monthly webinar series. It's called CDP Presents. These are 90-minute webinars, usually held once a month on a Wednesday or Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And they are on really great topics. The next one is on post-traumatic growth and resilience. Another one was on sleep and substance use disorders and the overlap of those two conditions. So please feel free to join our CDP Presents monthly webinar series. Those are free, and CEs are also offered for free. And then finally, this is some more information about the Center for Deployment Psychology. Our headquarters office is located in Bethesda, Maryland, at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. My email is here. I don't know if I put this on your handout, so feel free to jot it down if you'd like to be in touch at all about PTSD or moral injury, or if you have other questions. And there's some other information about our Facebook and Twitter resources. I'm happy to take some questions. I know we have a couple minutes left during the webinar.
Yes, hi, Paula. We have a few questions here, so I'll start with this one. Do you feel the DoD, or obviously the Department of Defense, is taking a closer look at moral injury?
I do. I mean, like I said, there's a really growing and prolific literature on moral injury. Some of those researchers, like Dr. Bill Nash, are tied to the DoD, or they've worked for the military. Some are working in or have worked at the VA. I think they are. I still think there's, a cadre of folks who really struggle with it and maybe don't distinguish it from PTSD, and maybe don't understand why there's the need for attention on it. But I do believe that more circles of individuals from the Department of Defense as well as the VA are giving attention to this important topic. Yeah. More can be done, no doubt, but I think people are looking at it.
Thank you. How do you identify spiritually integrated support? How do you identify when spiritually integrated support is inappropriate?
Is inappropriate?
Yes.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I honestly have not had a case, I've not seen a service member or a veteran where I felt compelled to refer them out to see, let's say, a more faith-based counselor or a spiritual leader or someone from their faith community, a clergy, or something like that. When I have gotten at spiritual or faith-based issues, I have felt like they have come out in the context of processing the trauma, where I learn about them in the context of how beliefs and values and thoughts have been changed. So, for example, one of my patients who I was using prolonged exposure therapy for, I was treating the PTSD, and over time uncovered that he had also a moral injury. When we were talking about the deaths of two of his comrades that he felt somewhat responsible for, once we started talking about how he had lost his Catholic faith, he was no longer going to church, that came out in processing the trauma. It allowed for us to kind of go down that avenue in a way that I felt comfortable enough with. I guess if I was feeling like some of the religious overtones just were outside my purview, I would refer, but want to be in touch with that other individual to whom I've referred. I guess I'm more of a strong believer that we can deal with those issues, but work collaboratively with individuals in the spiritual or faith community.
Thank you. For those that are not mental health providers, are there any obvious signs of moral injury that should move us to refer the client for mental health services?
So as you heard throughout the talk, issues around self-blame, guilt, shame, feeling ostracized, almost feeling like they've been kind of kicked out of the community. Those sorts of issues sometimes to me, are a sign that something about a moral injury may be there, or the spiritual component. Obviously, some of those things aren't going to come up in day-to-day interactions with professionals when mental health is not the focus. But I guess if you're hearing also of self-destructive like behaviors, some of which I mentioned, where it may be suggested that unhealthy coping is somehow tied to a bad traumatic event that occurred, you might want to be looking out for that. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer for that.
All right, we have a few more questions.
Sure.
How do you feel about vets helping vets as far as the psychological aspects?
I think it's definitely helpful. As Jonathan mentioned, veterans and service members can, I think, more easily talk with each other, open up with each other. They have that common language, that common ground. So I think peer-to-peer support, peer counseling, vet-to-vet groups, those can be super helpful. I don't think they're probably enough alone if someone has, let's say, a serious moral injury or PTSD. I have had individuals who I am treating for moral injury where they also in group therapy with other veterans, and I think that's helpful. They're forging social interactions, they're getting validation from their peers, so they're less feeling isolated. And yet I think the trauma-focused treatment that I was providing was essential for them to show really reduced symptoms of PTSD and greater improvement. So I think it's a great first step, or it's a great adjunctive component, but for individuals who are struggling with, you know, a more serious mental health condition, whether it be a major depression or a PTSD or moral injury or all of those, I would advise also encouraging them to get the therapy from a professional.
I noticed that you suggested a lot of closed-ended questions to get the conversation started versus more open-ended questions we typically use when initiating a therapeutic relationship. Is that a better strategy when dealing with veterans who present with moral injury concerns?
No, that's a very good point. I think you can use open-ended questions just as easily. The ones I listed, again, came from talking with my colleagues that, and maybe the way we worded them, if you can just make them open-ended. I think what's primary is opening up the dialogue, opening up that door in a not judgmental way where, like I mentioned, individuals at their kind of own pace can talk about these things. So they need not be closed-ended. Open-ended will work great. Some of those you could, again, make more open-ended. Basically, what we wanted to convey in those list of questions is just a validation by saying other veterans have said X, Y, or Z. I think it's crucial for them to know they're not alone. So by starting questions by saying, I've heard this from other vets, or this is something that I'm learning a lot more about. It's not uncommon to have regret or remorse or feelings of guilt. And then asking the question, that's really important. Are there any other questions?
I'm coming back. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, my signal went down. I have one more question, but I have a few more on here, but I know we're getting close to ending of time. So I'll ask one more and then I'll help connect these individuals' questions to you.
Sure.
As an embedded counselor with the Navy, it seems many of our recruits come in with moral injuries and/or PTSD symptomology. How can we address moral injuries in this regard, non-combat deployment related, to service members?
I think that, like Jonathan was mentioning, we have some service members that that come into the military because of prior trauma or not such great families or childhood. I think being open-minded to talking about how earlier experience have informed even their decision to get into the military, and being open to understanding how the accumulation of traumatic events, the more someone is exposed, the greater likelihood of developing a more serious PTSD. Being aware that those contributions may exacerbate something that then occurs in the military setting will be important. And recognizing that some of these folks, when they're encountering, learning the warrior ethos and some of those military values, if they've come in with those backgrounds, it may be especially difficult for them to integrate or fit in, and exploring them will be critical. That's a great question, though.
Thank you so much, Paula, for your time today and for your insightful information about moral injury. I know that we had a lot of great questions and a lot of very interested participants today, so I appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to switch back over to me and pull up kind of the end of this presentation. So I just want to say thank you all for joining us today. As a reminder, we really need your feedback. Please open your mobile phone and select your camera. Don't take a picture, but if you hover over this image, it's a QR code. It should pull up a link to our SurveyMonkey feedback form. If that doesn't work, I also included the link here on the page, and I'm sending it to you now, audience, through the chat feature. So please complete that feedback. This will really help us in terms of how this training went today for you, but also to have that feedback for moving forward. And this will also help us to determine what topics training information you'd like to receive at future presentations. Lastly, for those that do need CEU Kennedy, at ckennedy@every-mind.org. And again, that's Christy Kennedy. So my email address is ckennedy at every-mind.org. We will make instructions. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and thank you all for joining.